Kurt, you ready?
Yep. Welcome everybody to the June 5th edition of the Multi-modal Transportation Commission meeting. We're going to start as always with our study session, which begins at 5. And the topic for this study session is, my agenda is not up yet, but I believe it is preparing for the, thank you. Yes, progress of the neighborhood traffic management program. So I think there's maybe more to it than that exact title. I think we had originally planned on doing a redo of the Your Turn session that we had a couple of years ago at this point, aiming to invite members of neighborhood associations, probably through LAND, the Lawrence Association of Neighborhoods, and trying to see what they thought of the ongoing neighborhood traffic management program progress, if they were aware of all of the different elements of it, and how we could use their input to kind of guide the future of the next couple of years. So that was the plan. Given the study session is entitled the same way, is there anything that's changed, or are we still talking about that?
That's the intent. Still talk about that, yeah.
Okay, I just want to make sure I hadn't missed something. Do we need to do a preamble real quick on the hybrid format?
Yes, I'll do that real quick. This meeting is being recorded and broadcast on the city's YouTube channel and cable channel 25. Please remember to mute yourself during the meeting when you're not speaking. The chat function for this meeting is disabled. All chats will go directly to me. Unless you are participating during the meeting, please turn your video off. This allows the active meeting participants to be seen on the screen. You will still be able to hear the meeting. When you're participating, please turn your video on. If you have any trouble, you can send us a chat. The city reserves the right to mute people or turn individual videos off to minimize distractions during the meeting. And also, before we get started, want to introduce everyone, our newest member of the MMTC, Sean Oshman. So,
Hello. Welcome.
So I think since we'll probably have time, I can't imagine our discussion is going to take up the entire study session. May as well do introductions. That'd be a bad idea. So I guess I can start off. My name is Nick Kuzmyak. I'm the current chair of MMTC. I've been doing this since 2019, I want to say. That sounds right. I got my start here by being a member of the Public Transit Advisory Committee, PTAC, and back then or what was once called Transportation Commission, was made up of various representative positions for various interests, like the school board, bike and ped issues, an engineer. I forget what all the representations were, but at some point those became at-large positions, so it doesn't really matter anymore. But at the time, I was the public transit representative for PTAC to Transportation Commission. So that's where I come from. In my day job, I'm an environmental engineer. I work on things like wastewater and renewable energy, but transportation and planning have been great interests of mine for years now, so it's nice to actually get involved. Damon?
I'm Damon Baltuska, Vice Chair. I've been this commission since a little over a year now. I live in Pinckney neighborhood. My background's in architecture. I went to KU, graduated 2015, and I work just up the block. And I'm here because in 2019 I just started trying to use my car like as little as possible, and just like biking and walking around will get anyone, I guess, into this whole gambit pretty quickly. So
I'm Pat Collette, and I've been on the commission, I think, 2.5 years. This is my third year, and retired from the KU Transportation Research Center. A lot of interest in bike ped, as a cyclist, and so it's kind of my background.
Dustin Smith, I'm a senior project engineer with the MSO, focused mainly on traffic transportation projects and manage neighborhood traffic management program.
What does MSO stand for?
Municipal Services and Operations. It's kind of the combined public works and utilities department.
You might be asking about a lot of acronyms.
That's perfectly
There
fine.
seems to be a lot of
Yep.
Yeah, cool. I'm Sean, soon to be Sean Maple. We're in a name change because we got hitched. It's a whole nother story. And my wife and I, we lived in Boulder for 15, 20 years, and Boulder's a great place to bike everywhere, which I did, and it was wonderful. And one of the things that really drew us to Lawrence is the bikeability of the town. So we moved here in August, and we live in North Lawrence on Locust, and we love it. And my day job is we make decorative attachments for helmets, so things like kitty ears, unicorn horns, banana through your head, stuff like that. So we work from home, which is great, a lot of freedom there. And yeah, so we're stoked to be here. And as far as biking, I bike most places or walk. And I think that non-car based transportation is one of the ways that we build community and just improve the quality of life overall. So I can't really complain about stuff unless I get involved in stuff. So here I am getting involved in stuff.
So you have something to complain about?
That's right. I can complain right here. Yeah.
Are you helmet flare?
Yeah.
Okay, I've seen I think it's a van or something. I've seen around town. I've been curious about
It's
that.
hard to miss the van. Yeah, it's pretty bright.
That's awesome.
Yeah, we're world famous in Lawrence. Yeah. Yeah, some people get billboards. We just wrap the van.
Nice.
Yeah, it's a lot of fun. So thank you for having me. I'll ask a lot of questions. So be patient with me.
Well, thanks for joining us. And we've met before, but Dave Cronin, city engineer, and yeah, looking forward to having you on the board.
And we got acquainted before the meeting. Jake Baldwin, engineering program manager, also at MSO.
My name's Charlie Bryan, and I've been part of this since 2017, I think. It's basically the beginning of the MMTC. At the time, I was the appointee representing the health department, and then like Nick said, it's all kind of shifted to being at large. So now I just represent myself, I guess. And I had early on been involved at the health department in some of the safe routes to school work and Lawrence Loop kind of work, and don't do that work anymore. I'm in a totally different role now, but that certainly got my interest going, and I've enjoyed it. And I think this will be my last year. I term off, I think, finally this year. So it's been a good ride.
Hi, my name is Ryan Reza. I'm actually the formerly newest commissioner, but now I'm the second newest. So you're welcome. I graduated KU last year. My day job, I'm a data analyst for Kansas Action for Children. We're a legislative advocacy group, so I do legislative work at the state capitol. But I care a lot about public transit. I was a KU student for 4 years, and I only ever used a bus. So I didn't drive to school. I took the bus. And it was great. I live out in Haskell now, like 13th, and it's awesome because there's a bus stop next to my apartment building. But nobody my age cares about local government, including my friends, and I try to get them more active. And so I wanted to be more of a voice in the public transit community in Lawrence for younger folks, because a huge part of our population is college students, and I want to see more college students stay in Lawrence after they graduate, and like myself and my partner have, and we think one of the best ways to do that is by making it a less car-centric community.
Agreed.
Sean, nice to see you. And Jessica Mortinger, Metropolitan Planning Organization. And
Hi.
behind the computers, we have a couple.
Can you hear me?
And we have Hillary online too.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes.
Great. Hi, I'm Hillary Carter. I joined this commission this spring. My background is in urban planning. I work for an affordable housing consulting firm out of Southern California, San Diego. I work across the country. I've been biking for transportation. I'm originally from Austin, Texas, and I've been biking for transportation for about 2 decades now. I'm here because I want to help build an all ages and abilities network. I bike for transportation with my young children, 2 young children. And so I hope to bring that perspective to serving on the MMTC and the importance of doing that work. Nice to meet you.
All right. So since the topic of our discussion today is kind of centered around the NTMP, the Neighborhood Traffic Management Program, and we have 3 relatively new members, I feel like it may not be a bad idea to do a quick recap of what exactly that is, mostly for our understanding, but also because I think it actually factors into the discussion we're hoping to have with the neighborhood representatives as well. I think there are a lot of misunderstandings, misconceptions, and just, beneficial ignorance, basically. Like, people aren't entirely sure what this is or haven't really heard the overarching name, but they've seen the effects of it. Some they like, some they don't, but I don't think people realize that they're all connected. So I'm going to do my best to give an elevator pitch on what this is, but I may need the experts to correct me if I get something completely wrong. So neighborhood traffic management program has been going on for, I want to say, 2 or 3 years now. I think it was started right at the beginning of the COVID pandemic.
Yep.
And it's sort of a rethinking of how we make smaller residential and local streets safe for people who aren't just in their cars. The original approach, as far as I have heard, was basically kind of a long line of petitioners who would ask for speed bumps or some sort of traffic control on their roads in their neighborhoods. And once funds freed up, they would eventually get speed bumped. So if you're familiar with North Lawrence, a lot of those speed bumps were by a particularly vocal member of the community who was able to get those put through. But if your community didn't have a Ted Boyle, then there wasn't so much you could do about it, right? So it was kind of it was an interesting system that I think elements still could be useful going forward. But what it's been replaced with, more or less, is called the Neighborhood Traffic Management Program. And it focuses on everything in mostly residential areas between the big streets. So if you're familiar with Pinckney, for example, that would be everything above 6th, east of Iowa or McDonald, and south of K10 and west of the river. Sorry, not K10, I-70. So basically everything that's not a total arterial street. And the difference between the previous approach and the new approach is that instead of focusing on kind of simple and conventional engineering, we call them, methods to slow traffic, speed bumps, stop signs, we're now at the 5 E's. So we're trying to do a multifaceted approach to making traffic slower and safer through engineering, encouragement, education, enforcement, and
Evaluation.
Evaluation.
The data science part. So let's see, for evaluation, that would mean, I think, purchase of equipment to monitor and record speeds and traffic counts and kind of figure out what's really going on in the neighborhood, as well as, I believe, soliciting kind of on-the-ground information from people who live there. Enforcement is targeted enforcement by the police department, based on the results of the evaluation, by budgeting overtime for the officers to kind of sit at problem intersections, problem roads, and at least start by giving people a warning and let them know there is enforcement now happening. Encouragement and education, to me, seem kind of connected, but if you've seen those signs around town that say, we slow down for each other, or you're my neighbor, let's not crash into each other, I forget what they say, but that's the education and encouragement bit. We had folks on the steering committee to develop those signs and the message and everything, but that was a pretty big rollout as well. The engineering part is, I guess you could say, the most controversial one, because it moves beyond the typical toolbox of speed bumps and stop signs. So engineering is when the police can't be there all the time, when people can't obey speed limits, or when it's just kind of too difficult for anything but an actual physical piece of infrastructure, that's when the engineering kind of has to step in. So the Old West Lawrence traffic calming pilot is kind of the major deliverable of the engineering portion so far. So we went through 3 rounds. Dustin was there for all of them and kind of guided the process of talking with the engineering consultant and the neighborhood and MSO and us to try to pull it all together and go through a couple of iterations such that as many people were reasonably happy as possible, especially in the neighborhood. So that is getting constructed for real sometime this year, I believe, at least the first phase of it. So we're finally getting to the point where actual concrete's going on the ground as part of the engineering portion of the NTMP. So things have been happening. There's a dedicated budget of something like $300,000 every year. Maybe it's 200,000, but it's a couple $100,000. And part of our purview as MMTC is to kind of help provide input to what the money should be spent on, the phasing of certain projects, possibly the selection of neighborhoods for the next traffic calming pilot, stuff like that. So it comes up every couple of months in some form or another. And it's, I would say, a fairly big part now what we're looking at. So that's the NTMP. Did I miss anything? MSO, MPO staff? Was that pretty much it?
Maybe the 25-mile-an-hour speed limit.
Oh, I knew I was forgetting
I
something.
mean, it's part of enforcement.
That was a big one, yeah.
So
Changing the speed limit on all residential roads was done through input was gathered through an online survey, and based on the results, the speed limit of 25 miles an hour was chosen, down from 30, and signs were placed all over the place, like thousands of signs, right? So that is now the new speed limit on residential streets, and
Everywhere except for where it was already 20.
yeah, so parts of Book Creek and maybe parts of
Old West.
West. Yeah, that's all I can think of. Yeah. So yeah, that's NTMP. So what I think we were hoping to accomplish with this study session is prep for what we're hoping will be somewhat of a listening session coming up with members and representatives of the neighborhoods who would probably be most involved in these sort of projects and the pilot projects especially, to try to make sure that, I mean, really just to hear from them. Do you like what you see so far? Do you understand what you're seeing so far? Do you know what the NTMP is all about? Do you understand how the budget works, how the phasing of the project works, who chooses what? And you know, assuming all of that is true and they're knowledgeable, I really want to hear more about feedback on the Old West Lawrence traffic pilot. We know what people in Old West Lawrence think because we've, you know, Dustin's gathered a ton of data on that and thoughts and input. So, but we kind of want to see what to do next, right? Like, based on lessons learned from Old West Lawrence and what people in other neighborhoods think they might want instead, how can we, you know, improve the program, maybe roll it out to more than one neighborhood at a time, change the duration of the engagement and pilot so that we can get to more neighborhoods and stuff like that. So to that effect, I'm hoping to go through LAN, the Lawrence Association of Neighborhoods, and try to get at least 4 neighborhood representatives, ideally from 4 different neighborhoods, to come and talk to us. And what I want to do to make sure we're prepared is get some questions that can be kind of openers for a discussion. So the email that Dave sent out maybe 2 weeks ago or so was basically soliciting those questions from you all to, you know, try to get the creative juices flowing here. So I know Laura submitted some, but she's the only one of us not here, unfortunately. So I don't know if anybody's able to pull those up. I have them on my email, so I can get them eventually. But I mean, even if you didn't submit questions beforehand, I kind of want to open the floor to see what y'all think about it, how we might go about doing this. Basically, at this point, we've given ourselves a month before this your turn session. Damon, I think you said you had some questions, possibly, right?
I did.
So I might toss it to you if you're up for it.
I was reading over them before the meeting today, and I kind of realized I was describing questions more so like it would be like a kickoff of questions to ask the next neighborhood that signs on. So I have a list of those, and I can read some if you're curious, but I don't know if they'd be super applicable to just like all the neighborhoods at large, but
Okay. Let's hear 1 or 2 at least, just to start off with.
so a new one I came up with tonight that wasn't like the others would be if they maybe had any strategies for dampening the initial shock, especially to drivers as the next pilot project rolls out, like signage posted at the proposed site of the proposed design, etc. But then, yeah, like I said, the other questions would be more for like someone signed on, okay, here's initial meet. So for Old West Lawrence, they went in with a targeted goal of cutting down on vehicles cutting through. That was somewhat unique based on the location of the neighborhood. Would there be any specific goals for this neighborhood other than just generally slowing traffic? And if so, how would you prioritize that goal above anything else?
Yeah, it's possible that in some neighborhoods, they may actually have like problem areas that they already know about. Like, we know people do get hit here, or we know that people have trouble crossing the street here, or that, you know, cars hit a house in this area. So it did seem like in Old West Lawrence, it was just kind of general, like just make them slower and make them less. But, you know, I know in East Lawrence and Brook Creek, for example, I know people who have very specific complaints about very specific intersections. So I don't know how that would guide the pilot necessarily, other than maybe help the consultant pick an intersection first. But Dustin, in your experience, how much did they know specifically beforehand what they wanted to do?
It was kind of the the broad themes, the general, reduce cut-through volume, reduce speeds everywhere, but there were also specific intersections and locations identified. There was a, high severity crash at 8th and Indiana, kind of right as we were starting the project, and so that generated a lot of discussion. But and I think all these things are, kind of lessons learned that I identified as well, where, we really need to, at the beginning of the process, when we select a neighborhood, cast that broader net to the whole neighborhood and not just assume that the neighborhood association speaks for everyone, because we definitely heard that. But I think that, asking for those locations, that was valuable in helping to identify where we need to collect data to confirm whether or not it is a problem location.
Justin, does the MSO have data, like crash data across the city? Or, because we're talking about gathering data from the neighborhood about crashes. Can we go into the discussions with LAN with that information in hand?
We do have ready access to crash data, historic crash data going back 10 years or more in like a GIS map format, so we can get to it quickly. I don't, it'd be way too much to try and attach to an agenda or something, but we do have it where we can get to it and see it quickly.
Okay.
I think this might be good to point out that we do actually have a pretty sweet GIS map that I think includes that data, right? Crash?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. So if any of you are not familiar with that, it's super useful. Jessica sends out a link from time to time whenever one of us forgets where the link is.
I'm going to share this screen real quick and show you another something just real quick, if you don't mind.
Yeah.
KDOT just put together this Drive to Zero dashboard, which is for the entire state. And you can get into the data and eventually look at all of these different crash types. And so similar to some of the mapping that you've seen, but you can go to specific user groups. And this is you can just find this by Google searching Kansas Drive to Zero dashboard. It's part of their new safety campaign. If we can get it to load on this shared screen.
Is it based off of a Vision Zero framework, or does it just sound like it?
No. Well, yes and no. I'm not sure that they've committed to the complete Vision Zero methodology overall, or if they have just begun their their campaign is called Drive to Zero, but I don't know that they've set statewide targets yet as part of some work they're doing on different safety planning. But this zoomed in just to biped. You can see which years are included. You can see data sets. You can do this for every city across the state for their data sets if you want to look at intersection crashes. My point is, I think even more, this allows you to hone in a lot more on the data even than our locally developed tool, because it's a statewide data set and it's available. So yes, the answer, Hillary, is the data is available, and I think even more so the tools are getting better.
Yep. Yeah.
Great. Yeah, this is super helpful. Thanks, Jessica.
One of the questions that I thought of was, in the last round, in soliciting for the pilot project, there was, request for proposal, and I think there were two neighborhoods that responded, but one with the whistle answer was much more complete, and just asking the neighborhoods, what kind of support do they need to help kind of generate a plan for a proposal?
Yeah. What are the barriers, maybe, right?
Right. What are the barriers to applying or submitting a proposal?
I guess that might be a good question for MSO. In the information that was requested of the neighborhoods, I don't think I ever actually saw what the application of the process looked like. Once you got into it and started discussing with the consultant and the neighborhood association, was any of the information requested in the application okay, this actually didn't really matter very much? Could it be a simple, at the very extreme low end of complexity, does your neighborhood association want to participate in a traffic calming pilot? And then at the very high end, like, tell me the intersections, who's going to be involved, how much does your neighborhood association speak for people, stuff like that. So I'd be curious to see where it is now and where you think it might be able to go, just so we're prepared for that question and answer, I guess.
Yeah, I guess the initial application was probably more towards the more comprehensive option that you presented, where we did ask for, showing broad support from residents, from, churches, schools, I think we called them sponsors maybe. And then also we did ask for specific, identify specific locations, specific concerns you have, and then letters of support. And so that was probably the main thing that kind of pushed Old West Lawrence over the edge. Was I think they had around 60 individual letters of support from residents within the neighborhood. As, not just, yes, we want to be a part of the program, but, here's a specific concern I have.
Okay.
I know I did not send Dave a question because I couldn't think of any at the time, but this conversation's kind of generated them. How familiar are other neighborhoods of the project?
Yep.
Do people know that it happened in Old West Lawrence? I'm kind of intrigued about how prepared they're going to be going into this conversation and what type of engagement we're going to receive from the neighborhood association. I know that like the construction's fairly visible if you are in the area and you can tell, but kind of this whole program, I guess, how visible is it to the association?
I think the media has made it very visible, at least for the pilot and the 25-mile-an-hour signs. I think that's about it. I don't think the target enforcement ever really made it into the news too much, nor did the encouragement campaign. But the pilot most certainly did, and I feel like it did generate a lot of Facebook controversy. And I don't know how much of that is real and how much is just like the loudest 0.5%. But a lot of people heard about the pilot and probably couldn't connect it to anything larger, which I feel like is one of the biggest issues. There's kind of a disconnect, like, what are we trying to do here and what is actually happening on the ground and why do they actually matter being together? I think it also depends on who you get. If we get somebody like a Gary Weber or Michael Allman, they will be very familiar with this program because they're pretty plugged in to the stuff. If we get somebody from like Schwegler or I'm trying to think of another, or like Deerfield, who's maybe not as plugged in to land, then I think we might have a very different response. It'd be nice to get a range of that to kind of test your theory of like, do people understand it?
Yeah.
I'd like to see both sides really.
We did reach out to land, but then also all the individual neighborhood associations with the application and, hey, this is happening, this is the process, do you want to be a part of it? But, we heard from some of them that, they just didn't have the resources to do the application.
Yeah.
And I'd say in the 2 years since we did the application process, we get traffic calming requests frequently and from individuals or neighborhoods, and we've been very intentional that we were following through on the Old West Lawrence project and then going to reevaluate it before we went out again. So it's something I think that we will need to make another push before we do an application process again to make everyone re-aware of what the program is and how to apply and what the process is going to be.
And help them connect those individual requests with what this project is and how they are linked, because people may not understand.
Yeah.
There's a program that fits into that, and that you're still getting the individual requests rather than on behalf of the neighborhood.
And we do, when we receive those individual requests, we do, hey, this is the program, this is how we're approaching it now, this is the process, we'll have an application open in the future again, but so we're, as those requests come in, trying to make sure they know about that, so going forward they can be a part of it.
One thing, and I know this complicates everybody's life, but my perspective again is coming from an all ages and abilities network. I'm here with my baby, that's why you might hear some baby noises, but it's how I can attend in the evenings. Anyways, so I don't live in Old West Lawrence, but I benefit from there being traffic calming in Old West Lawrence because people go through there that don't live in Old West Lawrence, right? So I wonder if when we're honing in on neighborhoods to engage with, if we're also engaging with surrounding neighborhoods, maybe in that pilot project area, because again, it's not just homeowners or renters that are living in the area that benefit from traffic calming. It's everyone, right?
Yeah, I think a lot of the complaints that were received were from people who probably were cutting through the neighborhood and all of a sudden found it much more difficult to do so, or it slowed down there. And by people, I mean drivers who were cutting through the neighborhood, who suddenly found their path impeded or slowed, and that inconvenience to them outweighed anything else that was going on. So I guess it's tough to say sometimes, because you would think, logically, that the people who live adjacent to the neighborhood in question would be probably traveling through it. But it might also be people coming from who knows where. Like, I used to live in Pinckney, and 4th Street is a major thoroughfare for people who work at the hospital, who come from as far as Olathe and Topeka. So I guess it's hard to know who are the people who are going to cause a fuss, and, does their voice really matter as much as the people who live there? I think the adjacent neighborhoods would probably matter more than those who are coming in from other cities. But
yeah, but I think you bring up a good point. The people that are going to raise a fuss are the ones that are, that are inconvenienced by driving through the area. I live off of 21st, and it's like the people that are complaining are the drivers here, not the people that have benefited from using it.
Yeah, I think that's the kind of question we can maybe pose to land, in the way of, how can land be a partner in this and help to manage, I guess, expectations and input from neighborhoods that aren't the ones directly participating in the pilot, and kind of continue to be a conduit to us for extra information. I think they could be a partner, and enough of them are transportation interested that could work. But since, us commissioners, this is not our full-time job, it is hard sometimes to keep that momentum going outside of these meetings. So it's something I would like to see happen, but it's tough sometimes. So
Yeah, I guess
I think that's a great suggestion.
it kind of has me thinking, especially if there's areas where we do get a lot of traffic calming requests. I mean, I'm not a part of my neighborhood association, I'll be honest with you. But I'm recently moved out to Brook Creek, which is what I just figured out, like that the interactive GIS map. I know East Lawrence deals with a lot of traffic because of Connecticut, and Connecticut is really busy all the time. My partner lives out on Connecticut, and 13th and Connecticut is one of the more busy intersections that doesn't have an always stop. But, a lot of folks who live out in Brook Creek and Barker probably drive through that intersection and are would then suddenly be inconvenienced by an always stop, when people in East Lawrence, would benefit from it. That's something that specifically came to mind. So I guess I'm intrigued to see who attends next month, and if we are keeping track of who attends and who doesn't attend, and then potentially maybe reaching out to those associations who weren't able to make it, to make sure, because I'm sure that everybody, if you're not as active in a neighborhood association, but you do have traffic calming requests out, and you don't really realize that's the pathway to improvement. I feel like when we get into the weeds of local government, nobody knows what Multi-modal Transportation Commission is unless you're plugged in. And you might not understand that, we could have a lot of development in our community if we happen to be involved in this conversation that happens in a monthly meeting for a commission you've never heard of. So that's kind of the worry, I guess the worry I have going into this, is making sure that the people who aren't plugged in, but who may have a lot to say, kind of have the opportunity to say.
This is the biggest challenge for me.
Absolutely, 100%.
And I say that just because knowing from the neighborhood list, like for the neighborhood I live in, I contacted the woman at some point saying, hey, do you want to do this neighborhood thing? And she's like, oh, there's not an actual neighborhood association. I was just interested and no one else was listed. So I added my name and email to the list.
Yeah.
And so working on the other side of that, knowing that I think for many neighborhoods, the contact the city has on file is, if no one, the person that was interested signed their name there on the line. And that doesn't mean there's an organized neighborhood association or any organization of people happening within that physical area, because it's all self-designated through contact with like planning and development services.
I do think that's going to improve now that there's a community engagement person on staff, and I think eventually or neighborhood planners are supposed to be hired, or maybe already have been hired. I feel like that will probably help have something to maybe coalesce around these neighborhood associations that seem to want to form but don't really have any strong motive force to get them there. Like some are very slowly forming. I think what is it, Centennial or Babcock, like they're kind of coming to something, but even Land has struggled with that, and that's kind of their specialty is neighborhood associations, and even they struggle to reach out to associations that do exist, let alone the ones that don't. One of the questions that Laura had was, does your neighborhood have any barriers to walkability and biking? And I don't know if that was meant specifically or generally, but I feel like it should be taken both. Like, are there any streets that just suck? Like, you cannot get across the street. Like I don't know. Connecticut, for example, is difficult. You know, it's very wide. Or just in general, do you have barriers to walkability? Like, there aren't any good sidewalks, or like in North Lawrence, the streets are real skinny, and everything's a ditch right outside the. So you can do it, but there's not a lot of room for error. So that would be interesting to kind of hear from neighborhoods as well, and see if that maybe guides their thinking and what their application might look like. How are we doing on time here? Pretty good.
How many people come to these sessions historically?
You mean Land's monthly meetings or the your turn thing?
The year term.
We've only had one. Back in like 2019, was it? 2020? It was pretty.
Yeah, it was a couple years ago.
Oh,
Yeah.
And we invited specific people, kind of gave them,
A couple of leading questions. Or?
the script,
I think it was
and,
2021.
sat back and heard them.
That's what we did it.
Okay.
So it was really an effort to help engage them. Like, we didn't just say, hey, come to the meeting and talk to us. It was a little more structured than that. So this is kind of the same idea, like what are the set of questions that could prompt a neighborhood to come in and share with us their thinking on their neighborhood and the safety of getting around, primarily like walking and biking.
Is there an idea of the expected number of people who would come to this?
I would,
We're shooting for 4.
I mean, I was gonna say, for me, the success would look like 3 or 4 neighborhoods that would come.
Okay.
We only had 2 that applied to the process last time.
Okay.
So if that could be, a few more. And there are some neighborhoods that I think, like, have in my time at the health department, going back, like, there are certain neighborhoods that are always primed for this conversation. So to me, I'd be assessing, like, did those neighborhoods show up? Or are they still lost or confused?
Yeah. Like,
About the changes that were made. Because it used to just be a pretty standard, you didn't have to be tied to a neighborhood, you just had to be a person who complained, and then the staff would say, here's the process, and then you would go out and kind of follow the script, and then you would get a project queued up, evaluated, and if it met the criteria, you put on a list.
Mm-hmm.
And then that list was kind of a static, there's no funding committed to it, it was just an approved, when funding's available. The old Traffic Safety Commission would authorize or kind of recommend to the City Commission, hey, let's go ahead and put this traffic calming on that street. So it was one street at a time. It only engaged a couple neighbors. It wasn't very holistic. It didn't look at spillover effects. If you were in a neighborhood that suddenly had something going on, you might be shocked because you never heard of it. So it wasn't very comprehensive. And it didn't think about the whole community, like 25-mile-an-hour speed limit change. That was going to affect you regardless of this infrastructure piece. It was intended for us to say, how do we just help all neighborhoods? But it's still relatively new. People are probably confused still about it. So, like, I would think Barker would be ready to do this. I don't know who applied the first time.
only
So-
Old West and the East, I think, right?
North Lawrence.
North Lawrence. So North Lawrence would be
They'll definitely be
they would be
interested.
primed for this. Barker, kind of surprised me they wouldn't have applied. Brook Creek, East Lawrence.
And then that place that I don't know if it really has a name, somewhere around 27th and like east of Iowa over Louisiana, which is, I think, one of like the major transportation disadvantaged parts of the city, but also like historically underrepresented. That seems like a prime place to do a pilot like this, but like, who's the neighborhood leader? I don't even know what the neighborhood's called, honestly. I don't know if it really even has a name.
Adjacent to Indian Hills.
That sounds right.
To the west.
To the west, like, it abuts Iowa and like 23rd, I think.
So
There's no neighborhood there.
there was, but there was, you know, removal of crossing that really activated that neighborhood once, and that, I mean, that stirred up a lot of the neighborhoods there to get involved in the Lawrence Pedestrian Coalition.
That was Indian Hills.
Indian Hills.
That was Indian Hills. Here, let me just pull the map for.
Yeah.
The maps.
So what are you're thinking of a neighborhood near that?
Less than that.
He's thinking
The one that's
of
mostly
the
apartments.
transportation disadvantaged corner at basically south of
Yeah.
23rd Street.
East of Iowa.
Iowa.
Because Holcomb is west of there. It's like in between Holcomb and Indian.
I mean, this probably,
It's an odd area, but
so comparing with a new program versus the old program, they both have the challenge of, it does assume that someone in your neighborhood is already kind of engaged and willing to do the work.
Yeah.
And it's not paid. I mean, no one's, you know, getting a paycheck for organizing their neighbors. It does take a lot more effort by the neighborhood now than it used to. It used to just be basically one person, and they just got some people to sign off on it, and then the city had to do work.
Is there a reason why this kind of thing is not just generally open to the public, but has to, that like the person has to be associated with some kind of neighborhood committee or association of some kind?
I'm not sure that they have to be tied to association, or if they just have to demonstrate that they have some capacity to actually mobilize their neighborhood.
Yep.
But
That-
I think there is a tie to the neighborhood boundary. So it might not be completely devoid of the neighborhood area.
Yeah. That,
Neighborhood associations aren't always formed in Lawrence. It's, like, my neighborhood is on the west side, it's Quail Run. There's no association. If you go to the city's website, you'll see a map that shows the boundaries of the Quail Run neighborhood. And there you go. So what happens now is if on the city's list of contacts for the neighborhood, there's no one listed, then you can say, well, I'm willing to be the contact. And then occasionally, planning will send you kind of the official notifications when there's a development that's happening that might impact your neighborhood. And I guess in theory, your job is to pass on that information as best you can, whether you have an association or not. And you'll also reach out by realtors that are trying to figure out if there's a homeowners association that might have dues, and things like that are kind of off the wall. People might call you to ask you questions about the neighborhood that live in the neighborhood. Like, hey, I want to change this and build a different fence, and, you know. So you kind of, that's my experience. I get fielded by neighbors in the community, in the neighborhood, and then I get staff that'll reach out with information, and I got to pass it on. And I'm always contemplating, well, do I need to organize this group, or is it fine to just use, what I was told by Lan was, at the very least, get the, what's the neighborhood website?
Next door.
Nextdoor. Get Nextdoor going, because without a lot of effort, you can at least connect the neighbors together, and then it's all on their own. And so that's what we did. Just started to invite people to the Nextdoor site. And it kind of automatically builds a social network. Facilitates a lot of the communication without taking it to the next level of, let's formalize, you know, an association. And often that's, I think, all neighborhoods that aren't organized need, is just facilitate how they can talk to each other.
but we were intentional with the application to where we didn't require to be part of the neighborhood association. So you could just get a group of your neighbors together and apply. But you know, that's where showing the broad support and sponsors came in to kind of demonstrate that support without having an organized neighborhood association.
Thanks for that.
So there were a couple of questions just about the NTP in general that I've been pondering. I don't know if they would even be appropriate for this your turn session necessarily, so I was going to run them by y'all and see if it's even worth kind of talking about that. I think they kind of are the cause of some of the controversy and mixed opinions here. The first one is, as we've been talking about the former method of just asking for traffic calming in this street in front of my house versus the whole neighborhood, there's definitely a trade-off between traffic calming elements on their own and holistic solutions. One is that if we do holistic solutions, we kind of got to focus for a whole neighborhood for like a year or two, which does mean that we can't do stuff for other neighborhoods. If we're doing just the one-off solutions, it may be fixing the exact problem on that street, but there may be spillover effects when people now avoid that street because it's got a speed bump or something, or a stop sign that they don't like, that would have maybe been caught if we did that as a holistic method. I don't know if there's a way to compromise by having like, say we asked the city commission and they actually obliged, we're like, can you give us like an extra 50,000 a year to also address that long list of like, I want a speed bump here because I know it's bad. And then we can have that going and kind of get this drip of individual solutions as well as do the main event of the neighborhood-wide pilots. Is that even worthwhile? From a traffic engineering perspective, is there a greater concern of spillover effects from a single element?
Does that happen anyway? I mean, in terms of, you know, different spots where speed bumps are put in, but they haven't been part of the traffic management plan.
Yeah, we haven't put in any speed humps that are just isolated to a street.
Okay.
Or stop signs or
But
I was just thinking of like trail. I mean, some of those were put in.
Yeah.
years ago.
yeah,
But
that was before. I mean,
that was the
there
old
are,
process.
I would say there are streets that we hear frequently about that would benefit from traffic calming that we know. Walker, Harvard west of Wakarusa was on the list before. It's it's through a neighborhood. There's homes on it, even though it's a collector street. It's not going to affect other streets, most likely over there because of just the street network's not a grid network. So there are, I think, and there's been other ones that have come across in the last 2 years that, streets between neighborhoods that that would not affect other streets that could benefit. So it's how do we identify what those are and,
I think we have a process though that's going to do that. So part of our Safe Streets and Roads for All planning efforts is going to be a data-driven approach to a high injury network and proposal of countermeasures, of which traffic calming and other built environment, other crossing improvements. I mean, Dave, wouldn't you see that as a good opportunity to identify some of those projects that are maybe more one-off or not tied to neighborhoods where we could look at implementing countermeasures? They'll also be eligible, if they're part of our Vision Zero Safety Action Plan, for federal funding under Safe Streets and Roads for All for implementation.
yeah, if they're on neighborhood streets, if they're
I'm
on
saying
local-
they would be eligible for federal money if they're part of that program separate of the neighborhood streets.
Yeah.
I like that a lot because I feel like the trade-off right now is we had previously kind of a community-driven process, but it was really microscopic. We kind of shifted it to be a little more neighborhood-wide, but it still isn't always going to lead us to focus on the most dangerous parts of our community. And so when you have a neighborhood that's not organized, not connected, doesn't understand the process, doesn't have time because they work 2-3 jobs, yada, yada. Like, how can we still attend to dangerous areas of town where it's just not safe to walk and bike? If there's a way to do that, that feels really complimentary. And it doesn't mean we have to totally change neighborhood traffic management. We just lean on another program, kind of like how we lean on safe routes to school to address one population of our community that we care about, which is kids walking and biking to school. That feels like a nice compliment.
Do you think that there is a potential, conflict in approach between Vision Zero and Safe Streets for All versus the NTMP? I know you were saying there is something on the way that streets are looked at is a little bit different. So we're doing the 5 E's, right? And maybe in Vision Zero, it might be more about like safe vehicles and and streets that are designed safely from the outset, which is a little bit different from kind of retrofitting them to be more traffic calming. So do you think there's a risk that we have to rethink NTMP, or?
I don't think that statement's completely true.
Okay.
In the sense that I think the Safe Streets and All for program and doing a Vision Zero Safety Action Plan, it's gone away from the 5 E's. The new approach is called a Safe Systems approach. So if you want to do some education, YouTube some videos, I think part of our process is going to be doing a lot of community education around safe systems. It has some principles and tenets in it around, humans aren't perfect. We have to create environments that save lives, for imperfection in some of those situations. It brings in emergency response too, and not necessarily law enforcement in the same way as we think about safe systems, is the system, the operationally. So I think in that regard, what's different about the two programs is how they're thinking about the network spatially, where one is very much focused to a geographic area where there may be a street network in the neighborhood, but the other is thinking about how the network functions as a whole. Also, that includes collector and arterial streets, which may not be part of the neighborhood. Those usually are the boundaries of a neighborhood. So it's just different in that sense about project location, but I think they're complementary to each other in the sense that they are both recognizing all users, really about lowering volumes and or speeds where it's appropriate. So it's not appropriate necessarily to lower volumes on some of the higher volume streets where where our community has designed streets to funnel traffic out of neighborhoods, but so there's like different approaches.
Yeah. Okay, that's kind of the answer I was hoping to hear.
I think they're okay.
That's good. I think last time there was something you said that got me a little worried. It's like, are we gonna have to change our approach in NTFP with new stuff? But it sounds like because they're at slightly different scales, the funding source is different, they share enough in common that it's not really gonna be a conflict, which is good news, so. Okay.
I imagine, though, there's some things we can glean
Exactly. Yeah.
to further continue to improve on the microscopic part of neighborhood traffic,
Yeah. Like what more tools can we add to our toolbox for the education part or for the engineering part? I'm sure there's going to be plenty that will come out of this study, master plan. I forget what it is.
Yeah, the plan. I think elevating just our education about it, like you're talking about in terms of different countermeasures, but also the data and understanding the data and what it tells us in terms of getting to a very specific strategy that we're going to try to drive to zero. There's a lot of efforts happening, just like the statewide effort, that I think are all going to come into play as we talk about safety. The state is also working on a vulnerable road users assessment, and so they have some separate statewide driven work that they're doing that will, we've been consulted on and will be a part of, I think, on a larger statewide level about how they're going to prioritize safety.
I'm glad you mentioned the education component of methods and different kinds of infrastructure, because I do feel like another source of consternation was that, I don't really know how to say this in a good way, but I think people knew what they knew and they wanted to see what they were familiar with, and anything different was like, whoa, what is this? It does not work, obviously. There was a couple of comments as I was going through ill-advised Facebook things where it was like, why don't we just put a stop sign at every intersection? Because that has been researched and found to not work and actually make things worse. Or why don't we just put speed bumps everywhere? That was working fine. Was it though? Not really, So it's almost like, I don't know, there's a silly quote I come back to a lot with stuff like this where I think Henry Ford is quoted as saying, if I had asked people what they really want, they would have just said a faster horse. They didn't realize that what you really wanted is a whole new thing that you hadn't possibly conceived of, right? And I think that's sort of the scenario here. When people are confronted with traffic circles for the first time, or roundabouts instead of intersections, what is that? Once you get used to it, you start to realize oh, okay, there's a method in the madness. So I think the education part is probably pretty critical in terms of telling people some of these elements you're going to see are not things you're used to, and they may seem like counterintuitive, right? So, I mean, Dustin, you've probably done a ton of that already in your outreach with Old West Lawrence, because you've had to help explain some of those odd things like the diverters and the chicanes. So
that was definitely something we heard, was that people just didn't understand the purpose of the chicane.
Yeah.
Sean, did you live in Boulder when they did their street labs or street pilots where they piloted all of these new transportation solutions? That may be a good example of how to approach some of these things in the future.
Folsom was notorious for being a surprise every time you went down it. There'd always be some interesting new traffic technology that you would encounter. And I'd say they changed it up every year or two, and they would gather feedback from the public, but they isolated it just to that street. So that's where they would try new stuff. So that's something I was actually just thinking about as far as having these people come in. How much data is there that this committee historically has gathered of other communities that are like doing it great? You know, we want to be like them. And how do they do it? What tools are they using? And how did they get to that? What was the path? Because it might help them understand, because you don't know what you don't know. Because if somebody's, let's say, born and grown up and lived in Lawrence their entire lives, they might not understand what other communities might be using to make life better, to make transportation easier, increase quality of life, decrease accidents, whatever the case may be. So as far as this discussion with these community reps, maybe it would be helpful to be like, hey, here's a bunch of stuff that you've never seen in Lawrence that's kind of neat. So
Yeah. I do wonder, how do you educate them if they get selected? Like, how do you educate them before they even apply? Because it does feel like they're going to have to learn some stuff along the way. So it's like, when is the best time to give them an introduction to, you can't do anything. You have to do some things that meet requirements, and then expose them to the multitude of options that
We did,
are already kind of acceptable.
with Old West Lawrence, I guess that was kind of our first kickoff meeting, was traffic
Okay.
calming 101. These are options that other people are using. This is the intent of this device. This is how it works. This is what it looks like. That's where we started. And so we kind of did have, hopefully, all the tools in the toolbox as we went forward. But we did get back to people like speed humps. They know they work, so that's what they
Yeah.
want.
Yeah.
is this thing next week, I'm sorry, in a few weeks, is it too broad potential topic to do educational type things in association with it? Or is it worth covering?
Well, it's only 1 hour, right?
I think it's worth covering in terms of trying to set up what maybe we need to do more of educationally, but maybe not with these representatives specifically, but like as we go forward, representatives in general will need to know about this sort of stuff. So I think it'd be good to ask them, like, what materials would you need to help convince the rest of your neighborhood association to
Right.
move forward with this? I still think education is an important component of it. I just don't know if we need to do traffic calming 101 necessarily.
They also did, like Old West Lawrence clearly did their research and looked at other communities and then came back, well, they did it here. And sometimes it was like, well, they did something, but it's not really acceptable in our community, So it's hard to know when you're looking at another community that this meets the requirements, and not every community tries to follow those rules, I guess. So
Is there a tester street in this town? Like
that's what I was thinking you're going with.
Folsom is the tester street.
Yeah.
Fun.
Like that's where the city tries stuff out, and everybody's very patient with what the city does
How
with that street.
busy is that street?
Very, very busy. It's a very busy street. It goes right up to the university. It's got lots of stoplights, lots of crossroads, lots of bikes, lots of cars.
How many lanes? Does it belong to any particular neighborhood? And do a lot of out-of-towners drive on it as well?
Yes.
Look it up. Like, are we talking 2 or 3 in either direction? Like, is it a big old street or just like a mass street, Like, busy but not huge.
It's
'Cause I've not been-
Folsom. I'm trying to think of a street in Lawrence that it would be similar to as far as a throughway. Folsom connects, not quite 23rd Street, but it connects a lot of the east-west streets. It's the biggest kind of artery between them.
Okay.
And it's, as
Like
far as
19th
its
Street?
space, yeah, it's like a north.
But maybe
Yeah,
more the
So that feels
between
more
like
like
downtown
a
and
collector
Iowa, where
street.
it's like 35 miles an hour. And
I'm thinking like that. portion of
Neighborhoods
the
and-
city,
yeah.
Between Iowa and downtown.
Yeah.
It's technically wide enough in order to have 4 lanes if it wanted to, but it doesn't because half of the total area is taken up by bike lanes on either side.
Yeah.
So again, like they've been experimenting with putting big concrete blocks in there, tall things, but people kept smacking into the tall thing because there was no there was no damage done to your vehicle if you just smacked into these high vis things. So, you know, like they learned those fun.
It sounds like a collector street, and our work is really around residential. But I think getting maybe to the idea of how do you help people to see possibility, there are places I would point to in Lawrence to say, oh, if you haven't seen that, just go over blah, blah, blah. Like when Old West Lawrence was talking about how they wanted the traffic circles and they wanted stop signs, it's like, no, they don't usually go together. In fact, that's an exception to the rule. So, well, no, we have to have both. Because that's how the pilot worked. I'm like, just go to Harvard, go drive west, and that's how it is until I guess you cross Wakarusa. Hadn't thought about that's when they stop having all the roundabouts. But if you're on Harvard, it's like constantly roundabout here, another roundabout. And there's some bumps, some speed humps, but it's mostly like roundabout lane. And maybe that's a way to point neighborhoods that are thinking about doing this to, certain parts of the other neighborhoods where they can kind of get a sample of what it looks like and how the neighborhood, gets impacted by it. What's the university? What's the one called over here? South of the University Heights. So that one, for 10 years, had these kind of ridiculous traffic circles that were designed to be temporary, but they stayed there for a decade or whatever. And now they have regular traffic circles. And, Old West could have just walked on over and taken a look at that. Probably, it's a grid layout, so it's familiar, like the same style. Compared to if you go west and you go to Harvard, that's not a grid design. So maybe you'll just feel like, well, that doesn't work for us. So maybe pointing people to examples of the different things that we see in a reference book, where do we have raised crosswalks? Well, we have them in here.
So I really like the idea of a pilot street of all the weird stuff, like a Folsom Street. I think that I'd love to table that discussion for another possible study session. It seems like it might conform more to the Safe Streets for All, because it sounds like maybe Folsom's more of a collector or even an arterial to a certain extent. I still think it's a really cool idea. I don't know if that's necessarily yet something we can pursue, but once we start getting into the Safe Streets for All Vision Zero planning, I think that idea could come back and have some legs. I also have just seen that it's just past 6 o'clock, so we gotta start wrapping this thing up. Do we have any, forward action items? I, through Dave or just, CCing you, can reach out to LAN and say like, hey, here's what we're gonna plan. We'd like any neighborhood representatives who can to come, please limit it to one representative per neighborhood ideally, if there's gonna be a ton of you. Here's what we're gonna talk about in general, and I'm prepared to discuss NTMP. Is there anything else we need to do, you think, in the meantime?
So do you have a set of questions that?
I think from what we've talked about, I think I can synthesize a couple of topics at least.
Okay.
And then we can maybe start firing off the actual questions.
The one thing I wanted to add that I haven't heard yet is, I know pretty much everybody thinks bike ped, but if we could expand it to think also about people that are using transit, that could be helpful. Because there might be a neighborhood that sees an improvement around transit access that, would just give us one more piece of that multimodal puzzle.
Okay. Any other final thoughts from the commission or staff?
I would just offer, I know Old West Lawrence, they've offered to, kind of share the lessons learned. I don't know if that's appropriate to invite them next month.
I would really hope that at least Charlie could come. Tressa, I think, is the neighborhood representative, maybe? I don't know if she still is. Maybe it's Eric. Kyle might be an interesting voice as well, because he was kind of the opposition leader, right? So just to kind of see how things came together. So yeah, I'll make sure when I reach out to Landa specifically, tell all this Lawrence, like, we'd like your guys' input if you can, because you've been through it. So. And I'll just do my best to kind of coalesce these questions we've had into a couple topics, and if there's anything that you are particularly is interested in that slips through the cracks, we can always just bring that up during the meeting. So hopefully there should be time. So that's it. In that case, we're adjourned until 6:15, and our normal meeting starts. Lively discussion, everybody. Kurt, are we ready?
Yes.
Yeah, cool. All right, everybody. Sorry to cut off the conversations here. All right, welcome back to the normal agenda portion of the June 5th Multimodal Transportation Commission monthly meeting. We've already done all of our preamble and hybrid meeting rules, so we're just going to launch right into item B, approve the minutes. So I'd ask for any potential revisions or comments or questions on the May 1st meeting minutes. And if not, then I'll ask for a motion to approve.
I move to approve the minute as written.
I second.
Okay, first by Commissioner Rosa, second by Commissioner Collette. All in favor, raise your hands. It's unanimous. Okay. Next part is general public comment. The public is allowed to speak to any items or issues that are not scheduled on the regular agenda. Public comment will not be received for staff items, commission items, or calendar. Each person or organization will be limited to 3 minutes. As a general practice, the commission will not discuss or debate these items, nor will the commission make decisions on items presented at this time. Individuals are asked to come to the microphones, sign in, and state their name and address. Speakers should address all comments to the commission. And I guess I should add, it's not just come up to the microphone, but also online. Since any comments in the room? No. Any comments online? General public comment. All right. Christina, who is first?
I think JT was actually first.
Did you say JT was up first?
Yes.
Okay. Mr. Thornburg, can you please go ahead with your public comment?
I'd like to know if it's the policy, a new policy of this body, that public comment is not allowed during study sessions.
Yeah.
If I'm only allowed a comment, then I guess you're not going to answer that. My comment would have been to point out the lessons unlearned by the West Lawrence traffic program, calming program. I related that before. I will say that as an engineering control, it was not addressed as such. The Idaho stop. I'll point out that another Midwest state will be adopting that this summer. That's Minnesota. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you for your comment. And though we usually don't address comments, that was a good question. We definitely do need to have public comments in study sessions. So I apologize for that oversight. I don't think I saw anybody on at the time, but I may have not looked at the right time either. So that one's on me. As for the lessons learned by the Old West Lawrence pilot, I think bringing up the idea of not just engineering controls, but also of legal things may be of interest. I don't know if it's necessarily within the purview of the NTMP, but it's certainly something that we could continue to engage with the neighborhood representatives on. So, okay. Mr. Allman, are you up next? I saw your hand virtually raised.
Hi, yes, thank you, Mr. Kuzmyak. Can everybody hear me?
Yep.
Okay, thank you. First of all, I want to thank the city engineer and staff for the installation finally of the bikeway between 23rd Street and 19th Street on Naismith Boulevard. I hope everybody's had a chance to look at it and or ride on it. Multimodal Transportation Commission deliberated long and hard on getting that done and getting that goat path finally made into a real transportation corridor, completing that spoke of the Lawrence Loop. That was the last gap. So thank you for doing that. I think it was a good job. Secondly, last November, the Multimodal Transportation Commission, on the 7th of November, you discussed and adopted, as I recall, the bicycle pedestrian design policy guidelines that was developed by Trek Consultant. a lot of that was policies and design guides, as it says, but there are several things in there that I'm wondering when they will be taken to the city commission, because they will have to be implemented as ordinances. They're not policies, that, such as the right turn on red removal. That would have to be a city ordinance. The bicycle stop as yield, or the Idaho stop, as John Thornburg just pointed out, that would have to be an ordinance by the city commission. And most likely, the reverse angle back-in parking would probably be drawn up as an ordinance as well. So, you know, it's just kind of in limbo now. It's never gone beyond November 7th. And it certainly needs to if you're serious about pursuing those. And then finally, that whole policy guidelines by TREC, that was initially predicated on an ongoing discussion of what Lawrence considers as the proper, correct, safe, all ages appropriate bikeway. That many of us do not agree that the single white stripe is not a safe way to do a bikeway, that all ages and ability bicyclists typically will not use that. So that discussion never appeared in this policy that you discussed on November 7th. And it was the very reason that policy came about. That whole discussion is here and there, and we'd like to have that discussion sometime. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Ullman. Okay. Are there any other public comments online? Okay. All right. Next up then is the regular agenda. So agenda item number 1 is to receive the Lawrence Loop plans from 8th Street to 7th Street, Santa Fe Station project field check, and provide feedback.
Good evening, Commissioners. Jake Wallen, Engineering Program Manager with Municipal Services and Operations. The agenda item tonight, yes, to just receive the field check plans for this unconstructed segment of the loop. To get your bearing straight, looking at the map there on the screen, north is up. You've got 8th Street running east to west on the south, or the bottom part of the page. So this is the trail section that'll connect from our 8th and Delaware Street shared use path up to the Santa Fe Depot project that completed some shared use path of that project. So it's just a small gap project there to get from A to B behind the historic Quonset hut property. Typical section is similar to what we just constructed there to the south going towards Hobbs Park. And about the only change that we've made to these plans, or going to be making these plans, is the installation of a raised crossing on 8th Street. Per the recently passed guidelines, that was one of the options we've got and recommended. So that is different from what you see on the plans. And with that, happy to entertain questions.
Okay. Any clarification questions from the commission?
Yes, I have one. At that intersection at 8th Street, it's a really blind intersection, you know, because of the parking that is facing eastbound on 8th Street. And I'm curious whether raised crosswalk is, and it's also it's not a all-way stop at that intersection. You know, three-way, it would be a three-way stop. You have to get out into the intersection pretty far before you can see traffic coming, and I'm concerned that a raised crosswalk might not be enough in terms of, because there's quite a bit of truck traffic that goes back and forth right at that intersection, and they're traveling at pretty good speeds sometime, and I'm just curious whether that raised crosswalk would be sufficient for someone coming across on the path.
Yeah, the interesting situation is the railroad crossing right there and the control arms that are there makes it a little more difficult to add any additional, I think, signalization. Something we can look at, though.
Yeah, I mean, I think it doesn't seem to be, well, the traffic coming from the east is not a problem because, someone walking or on a bicycle, they can see from that direction, but I think it's the other direction that creates the problem, that you're not able to see traffic coming, and, if someone doesn't pay attention to even the raised crosswalk, I think it's still going to be a pretty dangerous situation for someone crossing on the loop at that point.
Is it possible to put in a pedestrian hybrid beacon there, or is that part of the conflict with the railroads or the Amtrak station?
Yeah, I think it'd be difficult to install any signalization right next to the railroad crossbucks that control that crossing.
Do you think a stop sign on that, on the west corner would be?
For eastbound 8th Street traffic?
Yeah, for eastbound, do you think that would be in conflict with the railroad crossing?
I think we'd have to look to see if it's warranted.
Yeah, I'd like you to see, if there's something that could be done there.
Would something like a rectangular rapid flashing beacon be useful in that situation? It's not a traffic control device.
I'd have to consider that.
Okay.
This is a question. Is the blind spot from Delaware? So if you're, or is it?
It's on 8th Street. So for traffic on 8th Street, but you're crossing 8th Street. So if you're going, if you're northbound and then crossing over 8th Street, on the continuation of the path, that's where, when you come up to that intersection, you can't see traffic there until you get pretty far out into the intersection.
So traffic going eastbound on 8th, there's a blind spot there. Oh, okay.
Well, it's a blind spot for for either one, for them to see that someone's at the crosswalk, and then also for, if you're on a bicycle, right now there's no path, and so you're on the street and you have to basically, stop and, and get out into the street pretty far before you can see that there are no cars coming.
I mean, isn't that the typical practice you would do as a cyclist crossing the street, though, is look before you cross? I mean, I travel this thing like 3 times a day.
Like I say, you have to be in the intersection, all the way into the intersection to see that there's no traffic coming.
I guess, as somebody who travels that quite regularly, I don't really have that problem. As soon as I get to the edge, I can see everything. But I may just not have the same perspective necessarily.
Well, and maybe if there are not always cars parked there, that could be a difference too, but.
Is the crosswalk going to be oblique like the crossing is? Sorry, is the raised crosswalk going to be as oblique as the current proposed crosswalk is?
I think it will be on an angle. I think it'll be skewed slightly. Maybe think what we've got there at 10th Street we just constructed. And I want to back up to Commissioner Bryan's question too about putting in an RFB there. And I think the real issue there is anybody traveling eastbound, they get over the railroad and somebody actuates that crossbuck's coming down on them, and we can't trap anybody there. So I think that's probably going to be out of the question.
Well, that's why, I thought that's why the hot signal would be inappropriate, but a flashing yellow light doesn't mean you have to stop, right? I can still see your point. It creates confusion. The pedestrian or bicyclist thinks someone's going to see that and stop. Technically, they would still be expected to stop if there's someone in the road, right? So it seems like a difficult place for someone coming across the tracks.
The reason I was bringing up the oblique crosswalk is because I think it would be cool. Anytime you have an oblique crossing that has a grade, it's much more obnoxious to kind of go over it. I think it would probably slow people down more than a perfectly orthogonal crosswalk, which I think would be a good thing. I don't know if the cement truck driver is going to like it, but you do what you got to do. So I guess I would just encourage that if there's any way to keep it oblique, I think that would be benefit.
I think the utilities that are existing there in the situation and the geometry is going to kind of force us into that situation.
Yeah, it's like there's 2 stormwater manholes that you just can't get around really, so
Right.
that makes sense. Cool. All right. Is the gate in the details meant to be access to the Kresnik property?
Yes.
Cool. I wonder if he sees it as kind of like, this is a bike oasis on the Lawrence Loop, you know, come on in, the gate's open during business hours. That'd be kind of cool.
It's been a collaborative effort.
Yeah. It's nice that the easement has gone a lot better here than it has at the other Lawrence Loop area. So, positive developments. Okay. Are there any other technical questions, clarifications from up here?
Yeah, I think Commissioner Colette's question has made me think, do we have a standard for a certain distance that parking has to be daylit away from a crosswalk for visibility issues like this one we're talking about?
I don't know if we've got anything in code. I think we'd technically look at sight distance for something like that at an intersection.
Yeah, there's intersection sight distance for stop signs and vehicles turning. As far as the distance to the crosswalk, which is on the east side, I guess, and there's no parking over there. Wouldn't see that there would be an issue with the parking, but certainly understand the concern with the visibility there on the corner on the west side. Yeah, and as Jake mentioned, it's a challenge with where how we would control that intersection with having the railroad crossing there.
Yeah, and I guess I'm just concerned about completing a section of the loop that, becomes something that's, still not safe for people who are particularly inexperienced in using that and kind of assuming that, oh, this is part of the path and I can just go through here, but, I understand about the railroad, and certainly from the other direction, the visibility is good and the traffic slows down because they're going over the railroad tracks. But they come at a pretty good speed sometimes coming from the west.
Yeah, it made me think if there's any, on that street, I don't think there's any traffic or, I guess, calming mechanism in that area. I'm trying to think. I don't think there's a speed bump. I think there's a stop sign at, New Jersey, going onto that corner, but I think that's just all from Connecticut. I think there's no stop signs or anything.
No, there's not.
So I guess maybe East Lawrence can take part in the traffic plan.
So just kind of a completely random aside, as I'm exploring the area through the eyes of Google Street View, just to kind of like try to rectify, what's on Street View with what I see. I just happened to land in a 2011 shot where there is no street there, which is wild. I didn't realize it was quite that recent. I've only lived here for 6 years and didn't know how interesting it was over there. There's just grass in the street and everything. So I've come a long way, I guess is what I'm saying, to having not even a street and now being about to complete the Lawrence Loop across this street. So going in the right direction for sure. Any more from up here before I turn it over to public comment? Okay. Anybody online who wishes to make a public comment? Okay. I don't think we really need to do anything. We're just providing feedback. So feedback received, I guess. Thank you for the presentation. All right, moving along to our next agenda item. Consider recommending approval of the Safe Routes to School Plan amendment and receiving information on the 2023 to 2024 adult crossing guard locations. This is a long one. Thank you, Jake.
All right, good evening. I'm Jessica Mortinger, Transportation Planning Manager for the MPO, and I'm here tonight with Dustin Smith and Brad Harrell, and we're going to jointly kind of present to you the work that we've been doing for the 2023-24 Safe Routes to School Revised Routes, Bike Ped Project identification, and crossing guard work. The Safe Routes to School, we're going to walk through the presentation of the memo that we released publicly and review some of the public comment to collect your feedback this evening. The Safe Routes to School plan has a provision in it that recommends revisions to the Safe Routes to School routes based on changes to boundaries. USD 497 this year made the decision to close Pinckney and Broken Arrow schools, and as a result, shift a majority of elementary boundaries, which required us to go back through a process like the one we did, what we replicated from the Safe Routes to School planning process that we originally did in the plan. Our Safe Routes to School plan, just at a high level, for those of you not familiar, has 3 different sets of maps that are accompanied with it. And this is important, and we can talk about it later in more detail if you have questions, but we're looking at the infrastructure maps today with this plan. And as we think about establishing routes, that's recognizing for us to think this route planning and evaluation normally would happen on a 5-year cycle. It's happening special because of the boundary changes. It's required because the Safe Routes to School designated criteria is integrated into many of the other plans and processes that you see around prioritizing projects that would be on safe routes. The infrastructure maps recognize in some places that we've designated something a safe route, it may not yet have infrastructure. This is why it's an infrastructure planning map. This is also why we have a series of maps, and we realized this from after our first Safe Routes to School process, because just being called a safe route doesn't necessarily meaning to encourage students to walk along that route. And that's going to be important tonight. And some of the network we'll look at, and I'll point out at least one area, and you may see others. But we then accompany that in a followed change in an annual process to create encouragement maps. And those are maps we work through public health to distribute to the schools and post on the Safe Routes, Be Active Safe Routes website. And those are maps where even though it's a safe route, we may not be encouraging kids to walk or bike on it, particularly if there's not existing infrastructure. So we would note maybe where infrastructure is missing or existing on those maps and use those as tools to encourage kids to walk and bike. You're not going to see those this evening. Those will be made over the summer after the adoption of our updated Safe Routes to School routes. We then also work in partnership with USD 497, and we provide them technical guidance to create some traffic circulation maps when we get responses about information such as where bike parking might be and where bus pullouts might be. And those are traffic circulation. It's more of a site-specific map. And those graphics are also used on the encouragement flyer as an education tool for parents. So both the circulation and encouragement maps are not something that we have before you this evening. Those will be worked on over the summer in relationship with the school and our existing conditions and public health to develop those. So what we're talking about tonight is infrastructure maps. The infrastructure maps, we recognize that kids live on every street in our community, and we have limited resources for transportation investments. And so we really have begun this process when we went through the first Safe Routes to School process to prioritize areas where we believe that we can funnel children into schools. And we do that by using a data-driven process to recognize we look at the new boundaries. And we receive anonymous student addresses from the school district. So in this case, we would have had K through 4 grade addresses from the current school year. And we look at those addresses where they would fall within each boundary in relationship to what school they were going to. That's not public information that we share in terms of student densities. That belongs to the school district, and they haven't given us permission to do that. But we use those to understand in relationship to walk sheds. So we use the model to create walk sheds out from the school to understand where half mile, 1 mile, 1.5 miles lie, and then consider other elements like existing routes, speed limit, traffic control, existing sidewalk or street network, street classification, existing bicycle facilities, crossing guards, or other crash or other information that we know of as from in relationship to our multimodal transportation planning, to develop a set of routes that we can use as a high-level network where we can prioritize investments. Particularly, we're looking at sidewalk, gap and bikeway improvement projects, although these safe routes to school routes feed into other things like sidewalk improvement and other programs in terms of prioritizations, because we've recognized the value the community has placed on prioritizing infrastructure and improvements on these routes. So things like future crossing, other things that are related to in the school area traffic control policy would come into this also. So we've done this process, and what I'm going to show you in regard to that, we'll walk through kind of briefly what those changes looked like. So for Cordley, you can see the addition south along Louisiana Street, and this is the northern section here is no longer within that boundary, so we're proposing removing that and adding this section to get the students who live in this southern, south of West 23rd Street in and a route to school. I'm not going to talk about the crossing guards yet. They're identified on this map in terms of where we propose pilots and existing ones that continue to meet the warrants, but that'll be a separate part of the conversation. We have Deerfield Elementary School. So as I talk about, when we talk about infrastructure routes, this green line along West 2nd Street crossing in McDonald, this is a place where we know there are large gaps and not great crossing infrastructure, that we would want crossing improvements before we would encourage kids to walk and bike in this area. And so this is somewhere where the Safe Routes to School Working Group identified an interim route that could be used that has grade separation and infrastructure connectivity in the interim until additional gaps could be filled in this area. The school district also has identified that they planned along this boundary area to attempt to bus these students also, so that was a consideration that weights in our reality around that proposal. But this is an example where the difference in the maps really makes a difference, because we would not identify that as a route for kids to use currently in an encouragement map, but it needs to be on our planning map and identified as a route so we can identify future improvements that can be prioritized in our process. You'll see here with Hillcrest and boundary changes, again, the remainder of the Pinckney students from this area and funneling into Hillcrest up 9th Street. Some of these areas, as you look at where the density is and where you're going to connect students, it became very clear to us, as we look at, you think about street classification, we mentioned that earlier, some places there are no other connection options. And so this option up 9th Street as opposed to down 6th in Iowa is really the route option that I believe we have to identify and develop to do that. And the reality of the school boundary, above the school closures and the school boundary changes, is more kids are going to be forced to cross higher volume, higher posted speed streets. And that's the reality of the situation based on decisions that were made by the school district. And I think we had a lot of those conversations with the working group, and what we presented to, knowing that we presented to the public.
Sorry, Jessica, can you clarify which working group, the one, the boundary change one, or the Safe Routes to School one?
I'm sorry, for the Safe Routes to School working group. So there is, you're right, a separate boundary committee, but in this regard, I'm talking about the Safe Routes to School working group. And our role was really reactionary to the boundary committee and the school board's decision, where we were made aware of when the public was, what the boundaries were going to be proposed to be and what they were. So part of that, in terms of the timeline we had, was also very compressed, and you'll hear a little bit more about that, because that's largely going to impact crossing guards in that conversation and the route we did to make sure we had ensued enough public process into this, because we had to make a lot of decisions in reaction to what decisions were made by the school board.
Right.
Here is Langston Hughes. This is a density issue in terms of students north of 6th Street, and looking at that crossing. New York Elementary didn't had some changes to the boundary, but they were a lot more minuscule. It was a it's their Montessori pilot school, and there wasn't a lot of density in this area as grid, so we didn't add additional route because it wasn't easy to identify additional route you could choose because it's so dispersed on the grid in terms of density, so there was no changes. Additionally, there's no changes to Prairie Park. Here, Quail Run, you can see an addition of Overland Drive in terms of a lot of student density that was added there. Schwegler, you can see the addition of this section, what used to be Broken Arrow route into school, and the removal of this section because these students mostly can choose either a northern route or a southern route. When we get to the public, I'll mention this now, but when we get to the public comment, I think, there's some confusion about how we chose routes, or people recognize that, this is 1.5 miles, but they could walk a shorter distance if they used Louisiana to 23rd Street, but we would have not chosen that as a route because it's a higher volume, higher speed route with a lot of turning movements along an arterial street, as opposed to taking a route through a neighborhood. And so we tried to make decisions like that based on the data we were looking at. Sunflower Elementary, you can see a change. There's a large density population south of 31st Street, and getting really, past that 1.5 mile, but recognizing there may be some non-public street network that people are taking to get to this section of route that we would be adding. Sunset Hill Elementary, here's a shift kind of also in density and where we're seeing students, and that reflects those changes. And then in addition at Woodlawn, which did not have a boundary change, but we did see a lot of increased density in that area that resulted in us adding a section of route there as we looked through all of these schools. Okay, Dustin, I'll let you talk about what that means for projects.
Thanks. So the next topic that I wanted to talk about was after we had revised the routes, then we took those new routes or existing routes and then overlaid our identified pedestrian and bike projects. And so that's what you'll see in the next, I guess, couple sections of maps and tables. So the first map is the pedestrian projects overlaid on the proposed routes. So again, the proposed routes are the broader yellow lines, and then the dash green are the proposed addition to the safe routes, and then the thinner red lines are the identified pedestrian projects and that would fall on safe routes, so then get that priority score in the non-motorized program of being on a safe route. And so then the following page is the table of those projects with, some more detail of where they are and the street classification that they're on. And then on to the second map is the similar proposed safe routes with the identified bicycle projects overlaid. And then the table of those bike projects. So now we'll switch topic to the adult crossing guards. So again, after we had identified the proposed routes based on the boundary revisions, then we started looking at our existing crossing guard locations and potential new locations that would have demand, or as Jessica mentioned, a lot of these boundary revisions are sending students across arterial streets. And so those were, I think all of the locations here in this first section were new crossings of arterial streets. And so typically those would meet warrants for a crossing guard. And so we evaluated these locations we identified based on our potential crossings from the pedestrian model against the warrant criteria in the school area traffic control policy for crossing guards. And so these are the locations we're proposing to pilot in the upcoming school year. But again, realizing the whole process is compressed, and this is a pretty heavy lift for the crossing guard program to have this many pilots. We're proposing a shorter term pilot period for each location of 30 to 60 days, as opposed to committing to a pilot for the whole year. And I guess that was also a lesson learned we had this past year of committing pilots for the whole year, and then some of those pilot locations did not see the demand. And so trying to more effectively use those resources and pilot more locations in the upcoming year. So again, the first bullet points are the proposed pilots for this year, this upcoming year. The next set of bullets, these are locations that were piloted this past school year, and we reevaluated when the guard was in place and the actual student crossing numbers meet the warrants to have a permanent guard placed at these locations. These are both adjacent to Sunflower Elementary on Inverness at 27th Street, and then Sunflower Park Place is the roundabout right in front of Sunflower Elementary. So again, those are proposed for permanent guards going forward next year. And then the next three set of bullets are other locations that were piloted this year and did not meet warrants with the actual student crossings. And so in the table, I think we show those as removed, but essentially those will be reallocated is maybe a more accurate term for those. And then again, just looking at the table, the 7 proposed pilots for the upcoming school year at the bottom of the table. And again, those say warranted, and the average number of students column in that table is based on potential crossings, not the actual students. And so we would place the guard for the 30 to 60 days, collect counts of actual students, and then reevaluate against the warrant criteria. We'll stay here and turn it over to Brad, some points about the crossing guard program.
Good evening. It's been a while since I've seen you guys, so glad to be back. My name is Brad Harrell. I'm the parking supervisor, and I also oversee our school crossing guard program. Operationally, we learned a lot during our first year of the school area traffic control policy. The management of school crossing guard staff continues to be a challenge for our division. The program improvement request was submitted through the city's budget process for 7 additional school crossing guard pilots. The timeline, as Dustin had mentioned, the timeline for budget approval and hiring prior to the start of school will be challenging to deploy crossing guards prior to the start. We will do our best to ensure that we communicate with USD 497 so that we can so they can return and communicate with parents. Depending on the final school start and end times, we are hoping that some of our existing staff would be able to cover 2 crossings. We currently have a number of guards right now that do 2 different schools that are in 2 different start times. So that's going to be really, we're hoping that'll help kind of bridge our gap between the time when we can get new hires in and, manage that increased service level. Following the implementation of the 2023 pilot guards, as Dustin mentioned, we quickly identified a number of crossings that likely were not going to meet warrants due to our, and we were really limited when, there was a crossing, I think, that was just adjacent to one that we had where it would be much better use of our guard at that location. We were unable to make that adjustment. So as he had mentioned, we're hoping we can transition that into a 30 or 60-day trial period. That is going to potentially cause additional hiring issues when you only are permitting it for 30 days to 60 days, but it's a willing risk we're willing to take because we think there is a benefit for us trying to reallocate it if able. yeah, this will just allow us to really evaluate the crossing and reallocate if we need to. So from an operational standpoint, that's all I have. The people that really do the heavy lifting are sitting right over here, but from a management, it continues to be a challenge.
All right. So as we went through this process, you can see we prepared a lot of evaluation to provide to the public, which required a lot of kind of investment and review of the materials to do that. We hosted 2 surveys online and at the MPO Tell Us portal, and from May 10th through the 23rd. We did 2 because crossing guards affect elementary and middle schools, whereas all the route and boundary changes were elementary only. As we sent those out, we had some separate questions around schools you may be affiliated with. We had 41 responses to the routes survey about routes and projects, and 18 to the crossing guards survey. This survey discussion, if you had taken a look at it, really gave you hopefully a high-level summary of what types of concerns we heard from the public. Some things, were some things very specific to their situation, some things system-wide in terms of things that you should be familiar with in your position as transportation commissioners. This just kind of helped us understand people's concerns and able to do that, obviously. Crossings and physical improvements, concerns with traffic and other route concerns. And we took a look at those. We then pulled these into the consideration of what we were looking at in terms of some of those requests. And I'll let Dustin talk a little more about that. I think each of these decisions is really hard because there's a lot of factors we didn't know. So some of the policies that we set ourselves up for in terms of with the school area traffic control policy and the option to pilot guards is going to help us in this situation somewhat, because it created our model to be able to understand what potential crossings may look like. I think as we as these changes are rolled out, I think there's probably more things we'll observe and that we need to be thoughtful about in terms of our continued process. But Dustin's going to walk you through these different summaries. When we initially posted this, we didn't have all the notes and staff action. We met with the committee late last week once we could get everybody together, and we've added some notes in our kind of action and response to that. And Dustin's going to go through those with you, and we can talk about any more of them in detail in terms of the discussion we had as a group.
Yep. So the first table of it's on sheet 25 of the attachment is we heard through the survey several requests for additional crossing guards or I guess new locations that hadn't been evaluated recently. And so that's, again, like Jessica mentioned, the first, I guess, 5 columns of the table are what came out of the survey, and then the notes and staff action are the discussion we had with the Safe Routes Working Group, as being visible that not only did we read the survey responses, but we're taking some action on them. So several of the crossing guard requests were locations that have been evaluated within the last 5 years, which is part of the school area traffic control policy that would only evaluate a location once every 5 years. And then I think there were 5 locations that were new locations that we haven't evaluated before, and so we're proposing to put those in the queue to evaluate, and as part of next year's process when we have time to do the full process, where we would take requests and evaluate them and then come back with proposed locations for the following school year. And then there were several kind of unique situations, and I guess just for instance, like the 2nd Street in Iowa was, I think, one Jessica mentioned when she was going through the map for Deerfield, where that's a location where we've added it to a route, 2nd Street east of Iowa, but there is missing infrastructure there. So I guess our action for now is, we would reevaluate that for a crossing guard once the infrastructure is in place. We wouldn't want to put a crossing guard there now without the infrastructure, which would encourage students to get there or to use that crossing, but no safe way to get to the crossing. But we can discuss any of the other ones in detail when we open it up if you need to. And so then the second kind of set of themes that we gleaned from the survey were requests for infrastructure improvements. And there were some common themes here of, crossing improvements, stop signs, traffic calming, those type of requests. And the ones that I think kind of all meet the criteria of, and are on a route, then we would evaluate, just through our normal process that municipal services and operations have for evaluating those type of requests as they come in for signs or crossing improvements. And so those will be, added to our list of requests that we process in our normal manner. I think that covers what we wanted to present formally and then open it up for discussion.
First. Thanks, everybody.
So going back to the infrastructure maps,
Okay.
I just wanted to make sure I understood the use of interim. That hasn't been used before, right?
No.
Okay, so is there like a time period that's, I guess I'm assuming this
So-
infrastructure is for planning, but then if it's interim,
So I would say the interim route would be more of the route that we're going to use on the encouragement
Okay,
map. That we
thank
would show that as the route, you could use it for encouragement. And once the other route was constructed, there would no longer be a need to, once the gap infill would happen, either crossing improvements at that intersection and the gap, sidewalk gap infill was filled, then there would no longer be a need for that interim route. I mean, it could still be a route people chose to take.
Right.
It's something we waffled with a little bit in terms of the conversation with the Safe Routes to School Working Group, because we know that typically in our previous process, our response from parents when we've asked them very specifically, would you like us to use the street network or the DeVictor Park Trail? Would you like us to use the street network or the Naismith Valley Park Trail? Would you like us to use anything versus a trail? It has always been use the street. And I think it's a safety, it's an eyes on the street kind of reaction to that. In this case, I think we felt like the traffic safety concern outweighed that the option of, in terms of infrastructure, in terms of there not being another option. If you look at this location, I mean, you're not going to cross at 4th Street. You're not likely to come all the way south to 6th Street to walk up 6th Street to go back down north, down Lawrence Avenue. So there, with that real lack of option in that regard, that was something that we felt maybe is a comfortable option in that interim. The goal, though, really there from the school conversation has been their commitment to bus those students. And so it will be seen, I think, what we hear from people or what we see. You'll notice in the comments, if you read through them all, we got a request for placing a crossing guard at West 2nd and McDonald. And our response is, we do not want to encourage students to walk there without infrastructure in this narrow corridor without sidewalks. And so our recommendation as staff would be to not place a crossing guard there, even as a pilot, until infrastructure is constructed.
okay. Thank you.
I had a question, kind of looking at both the maps and the survey responses, which, first of all, before I potentially critique, great job. I know that the timeline was very quick, and I remember us chatting about it earlier in the year and having this conversation. So really impressive stuff, especially with all the work you guys have put in. I can tell. So first question, how was the survey advertised? I know it was a quick timeline in terms of when parents or even community members could respond. how is this, how did we get the survey out to people? Because 59 responses is a little concerning.
Yeah, so that's not necessarily that surprising, first off. This was a very short 2-week period. So as we talk about challenges we have in communication, that's always going to be something we're challenged with. So if you ever have ideas for us of other strategies and techniques we should do after I share that, I would say first off, we're open to learning from whatever that is. We put out a press release. We used social media. We shared it with the school district. We shared it with public health to use our social networks to do that. Additionally, we had an open house to be able to answer questions for people at the library for a few hours where we presented all this information and also handed out paper copies of the survey. And that's the efforts we took in this short time period for a 2-week study. So it could be when we have other longer processes, we table or visit PTOs or PTAs, or, we've done other things when we've done larger, like the plan development for safe routes to school at large. This was a pretty short timeline for us to turn this around. And so we did the best we could in terms of using most of our online tools to communicate that this survey was available.
Kind of in tandem, and as kind of a response, did the school district send out a district-wide email in regards to this?
I don't believe they did. I don't have a child in the school district. Anybody who does can speak. I don't believe so. I thought they reposted our post, maybe on Facebook.
But I think also in general, that specific timeline kind of got lost in the end of school year, excitement and kind of informality of just getting to the finish line.
Sure. No, that makes sense.
I'll just throw in, actually, when I saw this, I thought, wow, that's actually impressive. Just knowing, how quick this was done, I wouldn't have imagined there'd be a whole lot of input. So I was pleased. I thought it was, not only the number I thought was satisfying, but it was what the feedback they got, I thought was good. And so, but I have a perspective informed by previous efforts, and I feel like, okay, if you're not familiar with that, maybe this seems, wow, there should have been more.
No, and I think that's important to point out.
One consideration is it was a short timeline, but it also, a lot of parents might have dismissed it because their neighborhood wasn't really part of the boundary change. So you might think, this didn't affect everyone, it affected a small group, even though it looked like you were open to feedback across the whole system, which was part of what impressed me. So it's also not on their normal cycle. So there's just a whole lot of things that made this a kind of an oddball to even do it, and the fact that it was done was really satisfying to me. So, good job.
I think my lack of experience in local government comes into play here, but I also think that's in tandem of how we can improve, because while a lot of the routes weren't changed, it still did have a district-wide impact, especially with 2 elementary schools closing. So, me as a person in the community who followed the closings pretty heavily, even though I clearly don't have a student in elementary school. That number did jump out to me, but really important context and feedback in general. I think also, this is a broader question. I saw that one of the parents kind of brought up the idea of marking the routes.
That too.
And so I don't know what the process is, if that's even possible. I know that there's an encouragement we saw last year's previously. That idea was intriguing, and so I wanted to make sure it was a conversation because I saw that as one of the responses. So I guess I wanted to hear a response from you all.
Yeah. That's not the first time we've heard that idea. Charlie probably can speak to that from way back when we were doing our initial Safe Routes to School work. It's something we've talked about as a strategy. There's a lot of national strategies about painting crosswalks with school logos, identification. It's not something we've worked through the implementation process here. And so I would think that could be a strategy we continue to have with public health and school. I don't know in terms of thinking about all of our needs and pavement markings and all of the other programs and projects. I'm not sure how that falls in terms of, I think we would see it more as a driven by community response. That's how it usually is in most best practices that we see for safe routes to school. So it can be something we continue in the conversation around routes to school. Dave, do you have anything? I don't know if you have anything to add about.
I mean, it's a cool idea. And I think a lot of schools will use like the mascot and just having those kind of stamped along the way. It's really an encouragement strategy, and I think it's a great idea, but it just hasn't really been done. So
I guess I'm not going to propose anything today because the timeline and also everything that happened.
When I was involved in it early on, my kids were part of the pilot of anything we did, so I would take them like, all right, this is going to be the route, so we have to go test it out. And my oldest daughter at the time was, she was starting first grade or something, so we walked the whole route, and she was with the camera taking pictures of things, and it was fun. And part of it is, how do kids enjoy this way of getting to school?
Mm-hmm.
Other than that, they get to spend time with their dad or their mom or something. But how do they make the route itself kind of exciting, Not just the feeling like, oh, I have to go walk to school. Like, well, what if, we had this little space that we kind of called, like it was a little forest, although it was just tree canopy that went over the sidewalk, but it became a thing that got my daughters excited. So I think those ideas are best done by the parents and the schools. But yeah, somewhere there has to be the energy to turn it into, actually implement it. Most people aren't going to probably complain if suddenly they see some painted stamps on their sidewalk in front of their house, and that helps to designate, this is the route kids take to get to school. I don't think there would be much objection. I think it's just a matter of who's going to take it on.
Yeah, I think maybe as we consider it in the future, adding some creativity to the walks to encourage folks. I think I'm all for that, and I mean,
maybe it's something we try to weave into the neighborhood traffic management. If you have a school in your neighborhood and then talking about trying to improve safety for your whole neighborhood, if there's a route, or is your committee even aware of it, and what are they doing to make that a more encouraging and safe route for kids to walk or bike?
Absolutely.
But
that's all I had. Thanks again, folks.
Really, to follow up on that, Jessica, this is great. As I'm looking at comments, I see a lot that are feeding into Cordley and Schwegler, presumably coming from a lot of Broken Arrow families. And I know, because I'm proximate to the area, that a lot of Broken Arrow students and their families walk to school. And my kids feed into Cordley, and I talked to the PTA there and said, hey, have people respond to this survey. But I also see, I think, the 23rd Street crossing as a pinch point for a lot of these families. And I know there's a new crossing guard proposed at 23rd in Louisiana on the Schwegler crossing, getting those Broken Arrow students over that way. I know, you didn't want to obviously send them up Louisiana and down 23rd. With that river kind of split with the split of Broken Arrow students going to the two schools, do you know in the design of how these routes were organized, did they follow along how the district had proposed splitting them? Does that make sense?
No, I don't understand what you're asking me. I'm sorry.
No, it's okay. The district had split the Broken Arrow neighborhood into kind of these different areas as to who would feed into Cordley and who would feed into Schwegler based on where they lived in the areas south of 23rd where Broken Arrow is. Mm-hmm. Did the routes follow, or were they responsive to the splits that the school district had designated?
Yes, so we received the boundary decision from the school board, and then we reacted to it and and created some route proposals. Does that clarify? So
Yeah.
we did see some, I do think you're right, we did see some comments around thinking about how we cross 23rd Street as a barrier, including one that asked to add a signal and cross at Vermont. You know, we talked about we have to be at a signalized intersection. And then we looked at, this is where, having done the work that we've done before on our school area traffic control policy, we have a pedestrian model that allows us to input the student addresses and use the network that's built in the model to route kids to the destination. And that model has different rules in it. And so when you set it to require crossing at those intersections, we were able to assess the number of crossings if we had no route preference, and we just said, okay, get to Cordley, how many students would be crossing at Alabama, how many students might be crossing at Naismith, how many students may be crossing at Louisiana and Mass. And then we looked at those potential crossing numbers in the sense of thinking about, well, if we had the crossing on Alabama Street, you're going to have to split the difference, right? You're not going to get everyone far enough on the east to walk that far up to walk back. And you're not going to get, if you put it at Louisiana, and that's why we went and added the section along Alabama, was because they're part of this density, even though there's not a lot of connectivity in here. It's a lot of private network through parking lots. And so people who live in some of these locations may choose to find a path through here that is not a public street. And we can't control that, but in that sense, we did feel like we needed to make sure that this part was the route and we were funneling students up north. We looked at that also compared to what the density was in terms of on the east side of Louisiana also, and recognized that many of the students in this portion you could route up Louisiana more easily and convincingly than trying to get more people to come through and to come up Mass to have to cut back. So we were trying to make some calculated decisions about behavior, about knowing where student densities were, about our understanding of what infrastructure currently exists, knowing that 23rd Street is going to be a crossing barrier for kids who used to go to Broken Arrow and maybe only had to cross Louisiana as the largest street and now have to cross 23rd Street. Does that help you understand kind of how we looked at the data to try to make a recommendation?
Yeah, that's great. And just your explanation of why to split it down the middle with Louisiana as opposed to going across Alabama or Mass or whatnot really helps clarify that for me. Thank you.
And I think as a system perspective also, ideally, maybe I think in the future we can see what actually happens in terms of observing what happens in these places in the community, what the actual result is. Since this has never been a movement that kids have been expected to do to get to school, there may be something we learn about any of these crossings. We also didn't feel like in this situation there wasn't enough students in those areas to warrant multiple pilot guards, and we recognize at a system at large, in almost all cases, we're forcing kids to cross arterial streets, which means we really needed to distribute resources to think about what all of piloting different locations of arterial crossings look like as a system approach to school crossing guards. We talk about the reality and cost savings to the school district. Well, it's a shifting of burden of financial resources to get kids to school under these policies too. So it's an increase in resources needed to increase those guards and the operation of them. And that still is pending a city budget process.
Side question to that one. Does the school district in any way contribute to those costs of
the school crossing guard program is entirely city funded through the city general fund, and so that has to go through the annual city budget process.
Yeah, we had that discussion back when the original Safe Routes to School policy, I guess, or plan was for it, and I think the answer was like, they just don't have the bandwidth for this. They don't have the funds. They're closing schools already. Though it certainly makes sense because there are schools to which MPO and MSO are getting kids to. You'd think there'd be a cost share, but it's unfortunately not realistic given their budget concerns right now.
If you look at the larger Safe Routes to School plan, the plan recommends some alternative options for locations where crossing guards aren't either warranted per the school area traffic control policy or there's additional desire. We've also, and that's volunteer guards, that's school staff to fill in as guards, maybe in absences, and in other cases, we haven't gotten support from USD 497 to do that, with a limited exception at a couple school sites where some individual staff have decided to do that. And student crossing guard programs. There's been national best practice to have older students do student safety patrols, and that's not something that was programmatically approachable kind of in our Safe Routes to School process, but it's something we recognize in the plan that could be options to crossing safety. Walking school bus is another option in terms of, we talked to a parent who said, really, I want a crossing guard at every intersection my child has to cross along 27th Street. And I'm like, well, what you really need is a walking school bus. You need a school champions that organize around collecting students along a route at a designated time to both encourage but also, safely route kids into school with an adult present if that's so desired. I think it's not a benefit to or an efficient use of city resources in that sense to place that many crossing guards if we can have a different kind of approach to that.
This whole plan is wonderful. And I'm curious, what percentage of students walk to school, having all this great resource of knowing exactly where to walk?
We are like in the 18 to 20% of
It's
students
around-
walking, biking to school.
Some schools, it's over a quarter of the kids walk and bike.
Is that mostly in the older neighborhoods or in the newer ones that have sidewalks in every?
No,
street?
Langston has a ton of kids that
Okay.
walk and bike. And that's a pretty large school on the west side of town. But it's somewhere. You can pull.
Yeah, I'm looking for it. That's what I was looking for. I think system-wide, it's like we've met our goal in terms of where we had went and originally in the plan. And our schools, one of the things we had benefited from is neighborhood schools. And so that obviously helps kids walk and bike. And so to the national average, we were far exceeding the national average in terms of number of students that walk and bike to school. I'm looking to see if I can find that data. It's collected, so twice a year, public health, as part of our Safe Routes to School planning process, coordinates with USD 497 student travel tallies. And that's where they work to coordinate at a district level going into every classroom. It's a national process to have kids self-identify, how'd you get to school, biked, walked, wheeled, got driven, took the bus. There's a checklist, and teachers record that information, and it's turned in collectively to the at the district level to public health, and they enter all of that information and track that both in the fall and spring. And so there's some seasonal variation in fall and spring, but it's something we have a history of data that's collected by public health to help track where we're at. I imagine there will be some obvious changes to that now that we have many students walking greater distances, right? We've eliminated some neighborhood schools, so.
And is there a target so that's where the current walking and biking percentage is for students in Lawrence? Are we trying to get to this based on this program and other programs?
Yeah, so in our previous Safe Routes to School plan, we had established a goal, and I believe the last year data, and I can't quote it off the top of my head, I'm sorry, but we had exceeded that. So do I think in the future that may change? Yes. It will yet to be seen kind of how this, it was to get to 20%, and I'm going to share this again, just give me a second. So in the plan, we had goals around increasing students walking and biking to 20%, and we were at 17.8. And based on the most recent data that we collected that I saw, it was over 20%. So I think it was like 20 and some odd tenths, but that varies a lot between schools. Mm-hmm. But I think it'll be seen to see where we're at. We didn't come back and reset this because we're also making those changes. So in this, we would do that during the plan update process on our 5-year cycle. But we also have goals around sidewalk gaps, as you can see here, in terms of filling infrastructure. And we've made significant progress. You can read through this plan in terms of where we've been over the last 10 years in terms of prioritizing investments of sidewalk gap infill for along our safe routes to school routes.
So that since 2014, the lowest measure was 13.4. That was spring of 2016. And the highest was fall of 2017, 18.4. And it sounds like there's more recent data that hit above the 20% goal.
It's wonderful.
So
This isn't inherently tied to this conversation. I think it's more of a conversation for next year's Safe Ride program. But something I figured I'd mention in that I'm curious to see what kind of branding or maybe graphics that we have that kind of is meant to empower parents to kind of take up some of that burden. Because I feel based on these survey responses and kind of this overall conversation we're having is parents are kind of emphasizing that the city's not providing these crossing guards and that multi-modal commission doesn't walk these streets, which is a couple of comments that I've seen. The burden is more on the city, which, you know, right, well, we're the ones kind of directing these conversations, while a lot of these potential complaints can maybe be addressed by kind of more community action. So conversation, not for now, but down the line, maybe something to look at is kind of ways to generate more community action within these systems.
And if you'll let me to respond to that, I think that's always been our goal, is to create partnerships across this program. It's not a siloed response. Our role, of course, as planning and engineering, as city government, officials, is to fill that space in convening the group to gather and discuss these issues and work on each of our parts. A lot of the branding part component has really been, and the communication directly with parents and through the schools has primarily been done by public health. And they, over the years, have had different grants that have funded different elements of that work. And so we haven't at all talked about the more robust Safe Routes to School program. If you came to our open house, you would have seen the boards that highlighted our whole toolbox of strategies we recommend. It talked about some of the success we've had around bike fleets and other elements of bike curriculum and other curriculum development. And that's a lot of the work that you haven't necessarily seen, because that's part of our partner agencies and working with the U.S. D497 and primarily public health and their role in doing that. And there is I think it's something we can explore in terms of how we buy in. I think from the initial vision in the first Safe Routes to School planning work, probably close to a decade ago, there was really a vision around identifying school champions at each school and creating really individualized school-based plans that identified a lot more kind of community and groundswell action that hasn't been the result of our Safe Routes to School initiatives. And I think it will continue to be something that we strive for as a larger collective Safe Routes to School issue. The challenge in some of that comes that the current participants working on this in that regard has kind of hit that brainstorm, is that's not really the role of an engineer. That's not really the role of the MPO transportation planner to run programming and this kind of community advocacy. And so we haven't yet maybe invited the right people or expanded the group or gotten the right structure to collectively move in that direction. But I think the more we do this work, the more important it is going to be to have success in it, is going to be getting more people involved.
I appreciate that answer. That makes perfect sense to me. Just something that came to mind.
You're asking great questions, and you just started on this commission when we kind of brought this up earlier in the year. And that has always been the challenge, is the level, to get up to that next level, there has to be a more systematic effort shown at each school level, and there's only so much that can be done by the partners, and if the school district doesn't see it as part of their primary work, then, you know, it's going to just still be a gap.
Right.
There's templates for action plans for each school. We've had training community-wide for school champions and given them the tools, the training, and, you know, parents move along with their children. So if you think about elementary, you're only there for a few years, and then boom, you're in middle school, which is over before you know it, and then kids want to drive, you know? So it's like the sweet spot is probably elementary, but there's not we're not investing the resources to make it easy for schools to do that. And where I was bringing up, like, we spent all this money on crossing guards, and yet there's so much more we need to do to make this really a viable program in all the neighborhoods we have. And the thing that's probably the, you know, highest level of investment would be those walking school buses, where sure, you get a crossing guard across every single street and a whole gaggle of kids, and they're all talking to their friends, having a good time as they're walking to school. And other communities have done that, but they pay people to organize that at a school level, and that is where we're kind of stuck. There's not a pot of money waiting to hire school champions. And when you try to hire school crossing guards, it's a really difficult proposition to hire those staff. So how do you, if that's already a challenge, then how do you find the money and find the people, you know, who's going to organize and hire them? If the school district doesn't see it as their work, then does that fall back to the city, who's already struggling to get enough crossing guards? You know, that's what I was like, well, we got to get out of the box. Like, Parks and Rec is awesome, you know? They have a lot of people they hire. I don't know how they pull it off every year, all the people they have to hire, but could they just maybe hire some neighborhood walking leaders that maybe do walking for kids and for anyone else that wants to walk? I don't know. But, and this is a project that our community always seems to be supportive of, yet it is clear if you've been involved in it for a while, you sort of recognize there's a gap that we're still not quite getting there.
I have a quick question, Jessica. What hours are the school crossing guards posted every day?
Well, I will let Brad answer that question.
Hi, this is Brad Harrell, parking supervisor. It's generally 30 minutes before and 30 minutes after the school is out is our normal hours.
But every school's different.
Yeah, and every school is different. So, and it also depends on, as we've discovered, the further away from the school you are, the longer we keep the hour. So it all kind of varies, but as a general rule of thumb, especially if you're close to proximity to the school, it's 30 minutes, and that number might just step out a little bit further the further you get away from the school itself.
Okay, thanks. So I'm looking at one of the comments under the Schwegler, or parent from Schwegler, talking about kids getting out of Boys and Girls Club later on, and, you know, from a sort of disadvantaged populations equity perspective, a lot of kids that are in Boys and Girls Club are from low-income households potentially, and maybe are at, you know, they're leaving at 6 o'clock at night, maybe getting into dusk hours. Has there ever been a conversation around having school crossing guards maybe prioritized at that time for safety-related reasons, or is it just start and close of the regular school day?
It's been a conversation in terms of, you know, just not always knowing different times that kids may have after-school activities. That's generally been the tone of the conversation. It's really challenging there because some of these crossings, the reason why the crossing is warranted is because of the number of students crossing in the time distance. That's a metric in the criteria, and oftentimes the quantity then of students all that would be using the same route that would be at that activity, there's no way for us to know that. And so the data becomes even more limited for us to even anticipate whether there would be crossing there, and we, based on our anecdotal evidence, don't believe that there would be a quantity along any route that would meet the warrants.
Gotcha.
But really, this program has only been ever, to my knowledge, at school start and dismissal times.
Great, thanks.
I had a quick question. I think shortening the length of the pilot crossing guards to allow you to be more nimble with using the resources where they have the most impact, I think that's a great idea. I'm just curious, is there a plan, like what happens when that 30, 60-day trial guard period is complete? Do we stop and look at the data at that point, or do we have like a planned next location for them, or are we hoping they turn into a permanent?
We're going to have to discuss that operationally for how that works. And I would say the first response, my first thought is we're going to have to communicate whatever we do.
Right.
And a lot of it is going to depend on two things. Our timing of the final budget approval, when we know that there will be budget to do it, and the ability to hire.
Yeah.
And those two things are going to dictate a lot about what we're even capable of doing in response to placing crossing guards in those proposed pilot locations. And so I think those two factors, particularly hiring and looking at, we don't know yet how all those, we don't know school starting, have those been decided yet?
No, not
Yeah.
at this time. And that's where this kind of just keeps adding to this challenge is right now, I don't even know if we have existing guards on staff that can potentially do one of these pilots. As I said already, we have a number of crossing guards that are doing 2 already, so obviously they won't be able to do a third. But I'm still hopeful that maybe there's 2 or 3 there where we can really reduce the number of hirees needed just to fill the increased service level. And you know, to go answer your question, I envision if, let's just say in an ideal world, we are able to hire all these guards and everyone's there after that 30 to 60 day period, and we've had, you know, evaluations occurring at that time, maybe, you know, there's part of this metric is not perfect, you know, when it comes to potential crossings. So if we can identify, hey, just a couple blocks down the road, it appears we are having many more students at that area, maybe that's a place where we can just transition that pilot guard into a new pilot, if you will, to try to identify and fill that need.
Right. Thanks.
It's going to have to be really responsive.
Yeah.
And we've learned that from our first round of doing this. And so what you can probably hear from us is a future amend changes to school area traffic control policy, right? To allow more flexibility and response in that process, just based on the experience in operationalizing that. One of the things I most recently learned, and after doing this work for a very long time, is that, you know, part of the reason around is transportation, is why all of our school arrival and dismissal times vary. And so figuring that out in terms of that's about bus service, that's about being able to run a second route on a bus, which costs less than the first bus and route out, and that in and of itself nationwide are experiencing driver shortages. I talked to some Johnson County schools, which are now for some of their elective rides are just doing single days with no busing in some of this process. So I think there's a lot of things we're going to have to watch and pay attention to that are impacted by the job market, which is not something you would expect to have to pay attention to in terms of operationalizing some of this, but it's impacted because of the nature of the work and what you're asking someone to do and how much you can pay and how you get there.
Yep.
Shall we move on to public comment?
Okay.
Is there anybody online who wishes to make a public comment about this agenda item? Okay. Just quick before we close this out, I forgot to mention earlier, but I really like the table of responses to each crossing guard suggestion and each infrastructure suggestion. Like, I feel like if people knew that staff was actually reading every single comment, like, let me think about that, I'm going to figure it out, I feel like there'd be a lot more, you know, faith in government and municipal services. Is there any way to communicate that back to anybody who raised those issues, just to kind of let them know, like, your suggestions are not going into a black hole, like a real person is reading these and actually evaluating if they make any sense?
So I think we have the opportunity to post that comments, that summary on the MPO Tell Us portal. We also then will be taking this through the MPO Technical Advisory Committee and MPO Policy Board, and the plan amendment portion of this will go to the City Commission for consideration, since it's amending what is the current plan. And so there will be, I think, additional opportunities for us to post publicly and share in public formats the work that we've done in the response.
Okay. I feel like it'd be a shame if people didn't understand quite how much has gone into this, because it's important work and it's a lot of work. So thank you all for your presentation. I guess any final comments from the commission before we move on? Wait, hold, is there an action here? Yes, recommend approval. Yeah, we should get a motion if we do recommend approval.
I move that we recommend approval of the Safe Routes to School plan amendment.
I second it.
Okay. A first motion by Commissioner Bryan, a second by Commissioner Carter. All in favor, raise your hands, please. All right, that's unanimous. All right, we're at a point where we have a couple of smaller items, and we could power through it, or we could take a quick 5-minute break. What is the general sentiment of the commission?
I'm good with going through it. I don't think there's gonna be too much conversation.
All right, sounds good. Let's talk about Safe Streets for All, Vision Zero Safety Plan Steering Committee.
Yeah, so as you may remember, we got a grant for the Safe Streets for All to do that action plan. And the MPO Policy Board established a steering committee last month. And on that steering committee, we have reserved a representative from this board. We're just really getting kind of started, getting a contact person with FHWA and getting that kind of ball rolling on our end. So it may be a little while before we start the steering committee meetings. But yeah, if there's any questions on that around this, just let us know. But yeah, we're looking for someone to fill in. And I think what we're thinking, it would be done in the next year.
Yeah, I mean, I think our initial goal would be that it's completed before the deadline for the next call for projects for Safe Streets and Roads for All. We've been somewhat delayed in getting an agreement and getting that going. So we don't want to rush a timeline to get a plan, and so we will respond how we need to based on that once we get a consultant on board. And so we have a procurement process and stuff, so.
Is the steering committee going to have a hand in selecting a consultant, or is that going to all happen before the steering committee convenes?
No, the staff will run the process to select a consultant. We have a staff committee that will do that. The steering committee will work with that consultant, though, through a timeline and public process to develop the Vision Zero Safety Action Plan, which will include reviewing existing conditions and data to set targets for a 0 year, and then identifying a high injury network based on the data, and identifying countermeasures and recommended locations for implementation of that Vision Zero Safety Action Plan.
Cool. Okay. Do I have any nominations or volunteers to be the MMTC appointee?
I'm really passionate about Vision Zero work, so I would be happy to serve on this if the other commissioners so desire.
Okay.
I nominate Commissioner Carter to serve on the Vision Zero Safety Action Plan Steering Committee.
Okay.
I'll second that.
I guess before we do that, just because that went relatively fast, is there anybody else who's also interested? Just because usually the situation is that we have a lot of crickets and one person's like, I'll do it, like, sweet, you're on. But I don't know, maybe I just wanted to make sure to give people a chance, so.
And you might just also procedurally open it up for public comment.
Oh, yeah. All right, so, yeah, sorry about the motion. Before we do
you can
the motion, let's do public comment.
Keep the motion in second, but just before you vote,
Okay.
see if there's any public comment.
Yeah. Oh, okay. Yep, Mr. Thornburg, public comment.
Still mute. Okay.
I'd just like to point out that there are no positions for consumers on this board, let alone victims. I will be taking that up with the MPO Policy Board at their next meeting. Thank you.
Would you care to define consumers and victims in this context? That might help me understand the comment more.
You folks are representatives appointed by the city. You are not strictly consumers. You are not users of the so-called system of public transportation, which would include all modes, including the railroad, for example, which you have never addressed. And when someone is struck by an automobile because of poor planning, or they have a collision, you never hear from them. Okay? Does that give you an idea?
Yeah. I guess I would just like to point out that every member of the commission does live within city limits, and as far as I'm aware, does use multiple forms of transportation. The rail line is I guess a regional national line, and just like the airport, and freight is not within our jurisdiction necessarily. As for victims, I mean, there's always a chance that somebody on the board is a victim, but it's not necessarily a demographic I suppose that was considered, so good point, but I don't know who the person would be to take that up with this, so. But thank you for your comment. Are there any other public comments online? Okay. Any more discussion from the commission?
I had a question that'll tie into the next agenda item. I see that there's also a PTAC representative, but if I remember correctly, this committee and PTAC will be, or is currently proposed to be one. Let's say if we appoint someone and they also appoint someone.
Then we'll have two.
Cool. Sounds good to me.
One from each
Great
that
deal.
now represent the new, and that may be not a bad thing, right?
Sure.
Because I'm not sure in all the transition how that will look in terms of appointments. So my thought would be it's a safe bet to leave that as a representative position, and you get appointed and participate in that role, and we'll figure out how we need to adjust this.
Works for me.
Okay.
It also just takes time. I mean, I think this was one of the first recommendations acted on by the city commission, and it was still 6 months after the Bike Ped Task Force issued their report. So that, commission or committee is going to issue their report, and who knows? A lot of stuff on there, from my understanding, is going to require legal work, and they're doing a whole lot more than the Bike Ped Task Force, so it could take a couple of years maybe to see all that change. Or maybe it'll be swift, who knows? I don't know.
Okay. Any additional discussion, or shall we go to motion? I guess the motion's already here. So it was a first by Commissioner Reza, second by Brian. Is that right? Okay. All in favor, raise your hands. Okay, it's unanimous. Commissioner Carter is our MMTC appointee to the Safe Streets for All Vision Zero Safety Action Plan Steering Committee. Catchy. All right, that moves us on to staff items.
Yes, speaking of the discussion of board restructure, the Board and Commission Structure Committee has released their draft recommendations, which is on the city website, and I believe the city has sent out a release on that to get public engagement and specifically sent it to board members. And so if you go to the website, you can view down the draft proposal, and there's a few different options for engagement. There's a meeting June 15th, 5 p.m. at the Carnegie Building, Friday, June 16th, online via Zoom, and then there's a digital questionnaire, which is open until June the 30th. And so as it pertains to this board, the draft recommendation was to combine the Public Transit Advisory Committee and the Multi-modal Transportation Commission under the Connected City outcome.
And maybe aviation, right?
And maybe aviation. So aviation,
A weird one.
they're also considering for the economic prosperity. So, yep, just wanted to note that. And if there's any questions or if you have any thoughts, please fill out the digital questionnaire or attend one of the meetings.
Yep.
And that is all that I have for staff items.
Okay. Let's go into commission items then. Do you have an update on the climate action plan?
My update is, once again, there is no update, but look for something next month. They're gonna, I think, put out a draft, so next month is the one.
All right. That was basically my update as well. We were hoping for the meeting in a box from the consultant by like last month at least. Still's not here. Might be here in the next week, but I feel like we've heard that before, so it's getting a little bit frustrating. I was really hoping we were making a lot of progress and things just kind of stalled for some reason. So I think we do have a meeting scheduled sometime this month, so it's coming up. I think we're soon going to be seeing the first draft of the, what's it called? The zones and the uses, which I feel like is kind of the meat of the zoning code, so that'll be interesting. I don't know if we necessarily need to have a study section on it, but it's going to hopefully start featuring into our discussions a little bit more as we start seeing some, measurable progress. So that's it from that committee. Does anybody else have any commission items? Okay, I have a couple. Michael Allman brought up the idea of those legal changes that were recommended by Trek in their design guidelines, but would require like actually making an ordinance. How do we go about doing that? I know we've talked about Idaho Stop a couple times, and I think the going response from staff is that since nobody else in Kansas does it, we would be going against state law, and it could be tricky and possibly invite conflict legally. So I have a feeling that's not changed. But then there's the no right turn on red, and I forget the other one. But there's a couple of changes that Chuck recommended that we'd actually have to like put into law. Then the other one is about the bike lane updates. If I remember correctly, that's part of the Bikeways program, and that gets updated every couple of years. I wish I knew more about that, but Jessica, that's under you, right? Bikeway plan?
Yeah, yes, we have a bikeway plan slated on a 5-year cycle, so we'll get back into that. I think we'll probably start it at the end of 2024, if I'm right on my dates, in terms of 24-25 project to do that. I would also remind you that decisions about implementing bikeway infrastructure recommendations are in your hands. And so many of those discussions we've had that are allowed for within the bikeway plan in terms of comfort, there is that conversation and provision. And so that probably needs to be a public conversation we have as part of the bikeway planning process. That would be my recommendation. But in the meantime, it can be your prerogative to decide not to recommend those.
Okay, that was my understanding. Thanks for clearing it up. Okay. All right, then there was the idea that came up of essentially wayfinding for safe routes to school. I think it's a really cool idea. I feel like it might be a major barrier in the same way that trying to figure out a bus route is a barrier for people who've never ridden a bus before. Like back before smartphones, you just had to know where it was going to go and know when to pull the cord. It was kind of tricky unless you really knew your city extremely well. And I would bet that for a 7-year-old, wayfinding is difficult. I mean, learning to read a map is part of education, and a lot of kids may not be there yet or really want to look at a map on their phone or on paper, right? So having like the Picnic Panther or whatever I guess RIP, right? Whatever the mascot is for the school that you're going to could be on the sidewalk or the street in some way, which would be super cool, as long as it's not against any sort of laws of, I don't know, vandalism. I think it would be cool to try to jumpstart that talk. I don't even know who we would talk to, though. Obviously, school board doesn't have the bandwidth for this sort of stuff. Are there extracurricular clubs at the schools? How could we raise this issue? And I'm kind of looking to the commission, because I don't feel like this is necessarily something that staff needs to take on in addition to what you're already doing. So I don't know if we need to necessarily brainstorm ideas right now, but I think enough people brought it up that it's worth maybe pursuing as one more thing that we can do as a commission to kind of help further things. So just just keep thinking about it. And next time we talk about safe routes to school, maybe it'll come up again and we can start kind of working towards a solution. So that's all I had for commission items. Anybody else? Going once?
I guess to make sure we had a answer was there on the ordinance topic of like, how does that work? I don't personally know, are we allowed to recommend ordinances to the city commission? Or would we have to do that as a private citizen?
No, I mean, in regards to the guidelines, those are guidelines for us to use judgment on and make recommendations. For the right turn on red, there are certain circumstances that it may be a good idea to implement that. And in the guidelines, it lists some of those. And so that's not an ordinance where we, must do it everywhere. I mean, we would not recommend that. So that is something that we are not considering adopting an ordinance for. The guidelines are attached to the bike ped design guidelines that we went through are attached to our citywide design guidelines. If there were to be more discussions on the Idaho stop, and I mean, that would probably get to the level of having an ordinance, but that's nothing that we got far enough down the road with the bike ped guidelines that we were taking any action to recommend an ordinance for that.
Sounds good, thank you.
Okay. If there isn't anything else, let's go on to the calendar. It looks like our next month study session is going to be your turn, as we've already talked about. So I'm going to do my best to kind of get some topics based on the questions that y'all have brought up.
I have a comment on that. I'm just wondering, that's holiday weekend, and whether we might want to consider delaying that till August so that we would get maximum participation. I don't know. That's.
Yeah, I kind of forgot about that.
Yeah, the day before, it would be the day before the 4th.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
It wanted to be Saturday, Sunday, so Monday, and then Tuesday's the 4th. So,
it's like
people
having the
being
Friday
out
after
of-
Thanksgiving, right? Like,
Yeah, yeah, right.
Okay. Yeah. Good point.
I mean, I would just hate for us to not get participation because of that.
I guess that's a general point to bring up as well. If any of you are planning on being out, let's know ahead of time. So if we don't make quorum, the rest of us don't show up.
I'll be here.
I'll
Okay.
be here.
Anybody else? I'm not going anywhere.
I guess a question, have we already contacted the neighborhood association about?
Nope. So yeah, that could work out just fine. Going for August instead. That means we got to come up with something for July, but something that Dustin mentioned during the study session was the traffic calming 101. Originally, I thought, man, that'd be kind of a sweet study session for us to have, but it'll be after the time when we actually talk to lane members. Maybe not. What if we were to do traffic calming 101 and you could kind of lay out the toolbox of what you've worked with for OWL and, like other kind of developments around the country, stuff you're seeing, stuff that ACTA has recommended, but maybe still kind of avant-garde. That could be maybe an interesting thing. If you're here on July 3rd, of course. If you're going somewhere else, then maybe not a great fit, but just a thought there. And then we could be even more prepared for an August 7th, your term meeting with land representatives. So we can work that out offline, but that's just an idea to kind of
Is August 7th
call an audible.
No, that's the week before. Sorry.
I think it's September.
That's September. You're right.
But I always forget when it is too, so. Okay, so let's go on that maybe happening. We're also going to be doing crossing improvement project recommendations. Sure, I know.
Correct, yeah, and that ties into those guidelines.
Okay.
That, and the funding that we have for crossing improvements. So based off that criteria, we've been working with our GIS staff to identify potential crossings for improvements. And we're kind of in we're working through it. Done a lot of work and just kind of got to pull it all together and see if we can get that together to make some recommendations. But yeah, that's something that we're anticipating to have for July.
Which is a good combo with the 5-year plan for non-motorized bike ped projects, which it almost seems like in subsequent years, these things may become one, just like the sidewalk improvements and Safe Routes to School have all kind of been rolled in more or less to the non-motorized project plan. So for anybody who's relatively new, this is something that we see like multiple times a year, and it's pretty important. It's a lot of the big, well, they're big for us. Big non-motorized projects that we try to help provide input for and see if the prioritization makes sense, if the funding is going to work out. So this is one where I'm going to ask you to do your homework as best as you can beforehand. And, you know, ideally, if you have any technical questions, send them to Dave prior to the meeting, because there will probably be a lot of technical questions that we can probably do, you know, I guess offline, just to make things a little bit more efficient. So that's July. I don't think we really need to look too far to August so far, because there might be some other project-related stuff that may come up in the meantime. So I feel like we're set for the next 2 months, at least enough. Any questions on schedule? Okay. In that case, I think we need to do motion to adjourn. So thanks everybody for the lively discussion, and see you next month, hopefully. That's it.
Congrats.
Timing on
May 1st.
transit.